The roots of what would become the Hundred Years' War stretch back nearly 3 centuries before the first English arrow found its mark at Crecy, embedded deep within the feudal complexities that emerged from William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066. When William's Norman forces crushed Harold Godwinson's Anglo-Saxon army on that October day, they established not merely a new ruling dynasty in England, but a web of cross-channel obligations that would prove increasingly untenable as both English and French monarchies consolidated their power. The Norman conquest created an unprecedented situation in medieval Europe. The King of England, one of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom, held substantial territories in France as a vassal of the French king. This feudal relationship, formalised through ceremonies of homage where English kings knelt before their French counterparts and swore fealty for their continental holdings, became increasingly humiliating as English royal power grew. The Duchy of Normandy itself, William's original power base, remained under English control until Philip Augustus seized it from King John in 1204, but other substantial territories remained in English hands. Most significant among these holdings were Aquitaine and Gascony in southwestern France, acquired through Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Henry II in 1152. These territories represented far more than symbolic prestige. Gascony's wine trade generated enormous revenues for the English crown, while Aquitaine's strategic position controlled access to the Pyrenees and trade routes into Iberia. The region's inhabitants, particularly the Gascon nobility, had developed strong ties to English rule over 2 centuries, often preferring the distant authority of English kings to the more immediate control that French sovereignty would bring. The feudal obligations surrounding these territories created constant friction. English kings were required to perform homage to French monarchs for their continental possessions, a ceremony that involved kneeling, placing their hands between those of the French king, and swearing an oath of loyalty. This ritual, acceptable perhaps when English kings were merely dukes who had conquered an island kingdom, became increasingly problematic as England developed into a major European power with its own imperial ambitions. Edward I had grudgingly performed homage to Philip IV in 1286, but the ceremony had been tense and awkward, with both monarchs clearly uncomfortable with the implications. The legal complexities multiplied as French royal lawyers, trained in Roman law and increasingly sophisticated in their arguments, began asserting greater control over English-held territories. They argued that as overlord, the French king possessed ultimate sovereignty over all lands held in fief, including the right to hear appeals from English territories and to intervene in disputes between English administrators and local populations. English kings, naturally, viewed such interventions as violations of their sovereign authority over lands they had held for generations. These tensions intensified dramatically with the Capetian succession crisis of 1328. The direct Capetian line, which had ruled France since 987, faced extinction when Charles IV died without male heir on February 1st, 1328. The question of succession exposed fundamental disagreements about the nature of royal inheritance that had been building for decades. When Louis X died in 1316, leaving only a daughter, Jeanne, the French nobility had chosen his brother Philip V over his daughter, establishing a precedent for male succession. This decision was reinforced when Philip V died childless in 1322, and the crown passed to his brother Charles IV, rather than to any female claimant. The legal principle excluding women from succession, later codified as the Salic law, seemed clear enough when applied to direct inheritance. However, Charles IV's death created a more complex situation. The nearest male relative was Philip of Valois, Charles's cousin, but Edward III of England possessed a potentially stronger claim through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV. If women could not inherit the crown directly, the question remained whether they could transmit hereditary rights to their male children. Edward III's claim rested on impeccable genealogical grounds. Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV the Fair, making Edward the grandson of a French king through the direct male line. Philip of Valois, by contrast, was merely the nephew of Philip the Fourth, his claim deriving through his father Charles of Valois, Philip IV's brother. In terms of blood proximity to the last undisputed Capetian king, Edward's claim was demonstrably superior. However, accepting Edward's claim would mean acknowledging that royal inheritance could pass through female lines, potentially opening the succession to future disputes and foreign influence. The French nobility, faced with this dilemma, chose Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI in May 1328. Their decision reflected practical political considerations as much as legal principles. Philip was French-born, French-speaking, and thoroughly integrated into French noble society. Edward, despite his Plantagenet ancestry, was fundamentally English, ruling a kingdom that had been France's rival and occasional enemy for decades. The prospect of an English king ruling France struck many French nobles as an unacceptable subordination of French interests to English ambitions. Edward initially appeared to accept this decision, even performing homage to Philip VI for his French territories in 1329. However, this ceremony at Amiens Cathedral proved deeply unsatisfactory to both parties. Edward's homage was deliberately ambiguous, performed in a manner that suggested reluctant compliance rather than genuine acceptance of Philip's authority. Philip, for his part, clearly regarded Edward as a potential threat whose loyalty could not be trusted. The ceremony satisfied neither king's sense of honour or security. Economic factors added another layer of complexity to these political tensions. The wool trade between England and Flanders had become one of medieval Europe's most lucrative commercial relationships. English sheep produced the finest wool in Europe, while Flemish craftsmen possessed unparalleled skill in transforming raw wool into luxury cloth. This trade generated enormous revenues for both English producers and Flemish manufacturers, while providing substantial customs income for the English crown. Flanders' political situation complicated this economic relationship. The county of Flanders was technically a French fief, meaning its count owed homage to the French king. However, Flemish cities like Bruges, Ghent and Ypres had developed considerable autonomy, their wealth from the cloth trade allowing them to resist both their count's authority and French royal interference. The urban populations, dependent on English wool for their livelihoods, naturally favoured policies that maintained good relations with England, while the Flemish nobility, bound by feudal obligations to France, often supported French interests. French kings increasingly viewed Flanders as a means of pressuring England economically. By disrupting the wool trade, they could strike directly at English commercial interests and reduce the revenues that funded English military activities. Philip VI pursued this strategy aggressively, supporting the Flemish Count Louis of Nevers against urban rebellions and working to bring Flemish cities under direct French control. These efforts threaten not only English economic interests, but also the political independence of Flemish urban communities. The economic stakes extended beyond wool. Gascon wine represented another crucial trade relationship that French policy threatened to disrupt. The wine trade from Bordeaux and other Gascon ports supplied England with its primary source of quality wine, while providing Gascon producers with their most important market. French control over these territories would allow Philip VI to manipulate this trade for political advantage, potentially cutting off English wine supplies, or imposing punitive tariffs that would damage both English consumers and Gascon producers. English merchants had also established trading networks throughout the English-held territories in France, creating commercial relationships that generated substantial profits and provided employment for thousands of English traders, sailors and craftsmen. French interference with these networks, whether through legal harassment, discriminatory taxation, or outright prohibition, represented a direct attack on English economic interests that extended far beyond the royal court. The immediate triggers for war emerged from Philip VI's increasingly aggressive assertions of sovereignty over English-held territories. Throughout the early 1330s, French royal officials had been expanding their authority in Aquitaine and Gascony, hearing appeals from English territories, intervening in local disputes, and generally behaving as if these lands were under direct French administration, rather than held in fief by the English crown. These interventions created constant friction with English administrators, who viewed them as violations of established rights and precedents. The situation deteriorated rapidly in 1337 when Philip VI took decisive action. Claiming that Edward III had violated his feudal obligations through various acts of defiance and support for French enemies, Philip declared the confiscation of Aquitaine on May 24, 1337. This was not merely a symbolic gesture or diplomatic pressure tactic, but a concrete act of war. French forces began occupying English-held territories, seizing castles, displacing English administrators, and asserting direct French control over lands that had been under English rule for nearly 2 centuries. The confiscation represented a fundamental challenge to English royal authority that Edward III could not ignore without appearing weak and ineffective. The revenues from Aquitaine and Gascony were crucial to English royal finances, while the strategic importance of these territories for English influence in southwestern Europe made their loss unacceptable. Moreover, the Gascon nobility and urban populations had repeatedly demonstrated their preference for English rule, making Philip's confiscation appear as much an attack on their rights and interests as on English sovereignty. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis proved futile. The fundamental disagreement over the nature of feudal obligations made compromise impossible. Philip VI insisted that as overlord, he possessed ultimate authority over all lands held in fief, including the right to confiscate them for violations of feudal duty. Edward III, while initially willing to acknowledge Philip's theoretical overlordship, refused to accept that this authority extended to actual interference in the administration of English-held territories, or, ultimately, to their confiscation. The homage ceremonies that had theoretically regulated this relationship had become exercises in mutual humiliation rather than genuine expressions of feudal loyalty. Edward's reluctant performance of homage in 1329 had satisfied neither king, while subsequent demands for renewed homage were met with increasing resistance. By 1337, it had become clear that the feudal framework that had theoretically governed Anglo-French relations since 1066 could no longer contain the competing ambitions and conflicting interests of 2 increasingly powerful monarchies. The failure of diplomacy reflected deeper changes in the nature of European monarchy and statecraft. Both England and France had evolved far beyond the loose feudal confederations of the 11th century into increasingly centralised states with professional bureaucracies, standing armies, and sophisticated financial systems. The personal relationships and ceremonial obligations that had once regulated relations between monarchs were proving inadequate to manage conflicts between these emerging nation-states. Edward III's response to Philip VI's confiscation of Aquitaine demonstrated the transformation of medieval warfare from feudal obligation to national enterprise. Rather than simply attempting to reclaim his seized territories through traditional diplomatic channels, Edward embarked on a comprehensive military strategy that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Western Europe. His first objective was establishing naval supremacy in the English Channel, without which any sustained continental campaign would remain vulnerable to French interference and supply disruption. The English fleet that assembled in Portsmouth harbour during the spring of 1340 represented a revolutionary approach to naval warfare. Unlike the converted merchant vessels that had traditionally served as warships, Edward's fleet included purpose-built fighting ships equipped with specialised weapons platforms for archers and early cannon. The king had requisitioned over 200 vessels from English ports, ranging from massive cogs capable of carrying 400 men to swift galleys designed for coastal raiding. More significantly, these ships carried approximately 4,000 longbowmen, transforming naval combat from the traditional boarding actions between small crews into large-scale battles involving hundreds of archers. Philip VI had anticipated English naval intervention and assembled his own formidable fleet in the Zwin estuary near Sluys, the primary port serving Bruges and the Flemish cloth trade. The French fleet, commanded by Hugh Quiret and Nicolas Behuchet, numbered nearly 200 ships and included vessels from France, Castile and Genoa. These ships were chained together in defensive lines across the harbour mouth, creating floating fortresses that could concentrate defensive fire against approaching enemies. The French commanders had positioned their largest vessels in the centre, with smaller, more manoeuvrable ships on the flanks to prevent English attempts at encirclement. The Battle of Sluys on June 24, 1340, unfolded as a devastating demonstration of English tactical innovation. Edward's fleet approached the French defensive line in 3 divisions, with the king commanding the centre alongside the Earls of Huntingdon and Northampton. The English archers, positioned on elevated platforms constructed specifically for naval combat, unleashed volleys of arrows that created chaos among the densely packed French crews. Unlike land battles, where cavalry could manoeuvre to avoid concentrated archery, the chained French ships provided stationary targets for English longbowmen who had trained extensively for this specific type of engagement. The French crews, crowded together on their chained vessels, found themselves unable to respond effectively to the English arrow storms. The Genoese crossbowmen, whose mechanical weapons required more time to reload than English longbows, were systematically eliminated before they could establish effective counter-battery fire. French knights, heavily armoured for traditional boarding actions, discovered that their protective gear became lethal handicaps when ships began sinking beneath them. The weight of their armour, designed to protect against sword and lance attacks, dragged hundreds of French nobles to the bottom of the Zwin estuary. Hugh Quiret died early in the battle when English archers targeted the French command vessel, eliminating French coordination and leaving individual ship captains to fight independently. Nicolas Behuchet, captured alive during the final phases of the battle, was executed immediately on Edward's orders, reflecting the king's determination to eliminate experienced French naval commanders who might threaten future English operations. The systematic destruction of French naval leadership would have lasting consequences for Philip VI's ability to contest English Channel crossings throughout the following decades. The English victory at Sluys eliminated French naval power as a strategic factor for nearly 2 decades. Edward's forces captured or destroyed virtually the entire French fleet, seizing dozens of vessels that were immediately incorporated into English service. The battle's aftermath saw English naval supremacy extend from the Channel ports to the Bay of Biscay, enabling unrestricted movement of English armies, supplies and reinforcements to continental theatres of operation. This naval dominance proved crucial for sustaining English campaigns in France, as it allowed Edward to maintain secure supply lines and prevent French attempts to isolate English forces through maritime blockade. The strategic implications extended beyond military considerations to encompass the vital wool trade with Flanders. English control of Channel shipping lanes ensured continued access to Flemish markets, maintaining the commercial relationships that funded Edward's military campaigns. Flemish cities, already inclined toward English alliance due to their dependence on English wool, found their economic interests aligned with English strategic objectives. The urban populations of Bruges, Ghent and Ypres increasingly supported English policies, providing both financial resources and intelligence networks that proved invaluable for subsequent English operations in northern France. Edward's continental strategy following Sluys focused on establishing permanent English presence in northern France through a series of coordinated campaigns designed to demonstrate French military weakness while securing strategic positions for future operations. The king's approach differed markedly from traditional medieval warfare, which typically involved brief campaigns aimed at capturing specific objectives before winter forced armies to disperse. Instead, Edward planned sustained military pressure that would gradually erode French resistance while building English territorial control. The English army that landed in Normandy during July 1346 represented the culmination of military innovations that had been developing throughout Edward's reign. The core of this force consisted of approximately 2,500 men-at-arms, professional soldiers equipped with superior armour and weapons, who formed the backbone of English tactical formations. These men-at-arms were supported by nearly 5,000 longbowmen, drawn primarily from the Welsh borders and northern England, regions where archery skills had been refined through generations of border warfare. Additionally, the army included substantial numbers of Welsh spearmen, whose tactical flexibility complemented the static defensive capabilities of English archers. The English longbow itself had evolved significantly since its introduction from Wales during the late 13th century. The weapons carried by Edward's archers were typically 6 feet in length, constructed from yew wood that combined flexibility with tremendous tensile strength. These bows could accurately shoot arrows at ranges exceeding 200 yards, with experienced archers capable of loosing 12 arrows per minute during sustained combat. The arrows themselves were specialised for different tactical situations, including bodkin points designed to penetrate armour, and broadheads intended to cause maximum damage to unprotected targets. English tactical doctrine emphasised coordinated combined arms operations that integrated the strengths of different military components while minimising their individual weaknesses. Men-at-arms provided close combat capability and served as rallying points for defensive formations, while longbowmen delivered devastating firepower against approaching enemies. Welsh spearmen filled gaps in defensive lines and provided protection for archers against cavalry attacks that penetrated the initial arrow volleys. This tactical system required extensive training and discipline, qualities that distinguished English armies from the more traditional feudal levies that still dominated continental warfare. The English advance through Normandy during August 1346 demonstrated the effectiveness of this integrated approach to medieval warfare. Edward's forces moved rapidly through the countryside, systematically destroying French military resources while avoiding prolonged sieges that would slow their advance and allow French forces to concentrate against them. The English army burned crops, demolished fortifications, and eliminated local military capabilities, creating a corridor of destruction that served both strategic and psychological purposes. This campaign of devastation, known as a chevauchée, aimed to demonstrate French inability to protect their own territories while generating revenues through systematic plunder. French response to the English invasion revealed fundamental weaknesses in traditional feudal military organisation. Philip VI's attempts to assemble a royal army were hampered by the slow mobilisation of feudal levies, whose lords required weeks to gather their retainers and march to designated assembly points. The French king's forces were further weakened by internal political divisions, as various noble factions pursued their own interests rather than coordinating effectively against the English threat. These organisational problems were compounded by French unfamiliarity with English tactical innovations, particularly the devastating effectiveness of massed longbow fire against traditional cavalry charges. The converging armies met near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu on August 26, 1346, in circumstances that favoured English defensive tactics. Edward had positioned his forces on a gentle slope that provided excellent fields of fire for his archers, while forcing attacking French forces to advance uphill against concentrated missile fire. The English formation consisted of 3 divisions arranged in a defensive line, with men-at-arms dismounted and positioned behind protective stakes that prevented cavalry from reaching the English position. Longbowmen were deployed on the flanks of each division, creating overlapping fields of fire that could concentrate on any point along the French attack route. The French army that approached Crécy represented the flower of continental chivalry, including King Philip VI himself, his brother Charles of Alençon, King John of Bohemia, and dozens of other prominent nobles accompanied by their military retainers. The French force significantly outnumbered the English, with estimates suggesting Philip commanded between 25,000 and 30,000 men, compared to Edward's army of approximately 9,000. However, the French advantage in numbers was offset by tactical disadvantages that would prove decisive during the ensuing battle. The engagement began with an exchange between Genoese crossbowmen in French service and English longbowmen that immediately demonstrated the superiority of English archery. The Genoese, positioned in front of the French cavalry, found themselves outranged and overwhelmed by English arrow volleys that inflicted severe casualties while receiving minimal return fire. The mechanical nature of crossbow operation, requiring complex reloading procedures, proved fatally slow against English archers who could maintain sustained fire throughout the engagement. Within minutes, the Genoese formation had disintegrated under English archery, with surviving crossbowmen fleeing toward their own lines. The collapse of the Genoese screen created immediate tactical problems for French cavalry commanders, who found their planned attack routes blocked by retreating crossbowmen. Philip VI's brother, Charles of Alençon, ordered his knights to ride down the fleeing Genoese, viewing their retreat as cowardice that dishonoured French arms. This decision proved catastrophic, as it eliminated the remaining missile troops in French service, while creating confusion in French ranks just as English archers began targeting the approaching cavalry. The first French cavalry charge against the English position demonstrated the revolutionary impact of massed longbow fire on traditional medieval warfare. The knights who'd ridden down their own crossbowmen found themselves advancing uphill against concentrated archery from multiple directions, as English bowmen on both flanks could target the attacking cavalry. The arrows, fired at close range by experienced archers, penetrated even the finest armour worn by French nobles, while the horses, lacking adequate protection, were systematically eliminated by English fire. The combination of dead and wounded horses, fallen riders, and continuing arrow volleys created an impenetrable barrier of casualties that prevented subsequent attacks from reaching the English line. King John of Bohemia's death during the battle epitomised the tragic futility of traditional chivalric warfare against English tactical innovations. The blind king, led into battle by his retainers, charged directly into the English position despite his obvious inability to fight effectively. His death, along with those of Charles of Alençon and numerous other prominent nobles, demonstrated that individual courage and martial skill could not overcome the systematic advantages provided by English combined arms tactics. The flower of French chivalry perished not through cowardice or lack of determination, but through adherence to military traditions that had become obsolete in the face of English innovations. The battle continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening, with successive French cavalry charges meeting identical fates against the English defensive position. Each attack followed the same pattern. Knights would advance uphill against concentrated archery, lose their horses to English arrows, and either die in the resulting chaos or retreat in disorder. The English position remained virtually impregnable, protected by the barrier of French casualties that accumulated in front of their lines. By nightfall, French resistance had collapsed, with Philip VI himself wounded and forced to flee the battlefield. The aftermath of Crécy revealed the broader implications of English tactical superiority for the conduct of medieval warfare. French casualties numbered in the thousands, including dozens of prominent nobles whose deaths weakened French military leadership for years to come. English losses, by contrast, were minimal, with most casualties occurring among the men-at-arms who had engaged in close combat during the final phases of the battle. This disparity in losses demonstrated that English tactical innovations had fundamentally altered the cost-benefit calculations of the medieval warfare, allowing smaller, well-organised armies to defeat much larger traditional forces. The psychological impact of Crécy extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The battle shattered French confidence in their military superiority, while establishing English tactical methods as the new standard for European warfare. Continental armies began adopting English innovations, particularly the use of dismounted men-at-arms and coordinated archery, while traditional cavalry charges became increasingly rare in subsequent conflicts. The battle marked the beginning of a military revolution that would transform European warfare throughout the later medieval period. English exploitation of their victory at Crecy demonstrated Edward III's strategic vision, extending beyond immediate tactical success to long-term territorial control. Rather than pursuing the defeated French army, which had scattered in multiple directions and could not be effectively engaged by English forces, Edward turned north toward the Channel coast and the strategically vital port of Calais. This decision reflected careful consideration of English strategic requirements, as Calais would provide a permanent English foothold in northern France, while controlling one of the most important commercial routes between England and continental Europe. The Siege of Calais, beginning in September 1346, represented a masterpiece of medieval siege warfare that combined traditional blockade techniques with innovative logistical arrangements. Edward established a comprehensive investment of the city, constructing fortified positions that prevented French relief efforts, while maintaining secure communications with English naval forces offshore. The English siege lines included permanent buildings constructed from timber shipped from England, creating what contemporaries described as a new English town surrounding the besieged French city. The English siege strategy emphasised economic pressure rather than direct assault, recognising that Calais' strong fortifications made conventional attack extremely costly and uncertain. Edward's forces controlled all land approaches to the city, while English naval supremacy prevented seaborne relief efforts. This complete isolation gradually exhausted Calais' food supplies and military resources, creating conditions that would eventually force surrender without requiring costly English attacks against prepared defensive positions. French attempts to relieve Calais demonstrated the continuing impact of Crecy on French military capabilities and morale. Philip VI assembled several relief armies during the siege, but each dissolved before engaging English forces, as French commanders remained unwilling to risk another devastating defeat against English tactical innovations. The psychological trauma of Crecy had effectively paralysed French military leadership, preventing effective response to English strategic initiatives throughout northern France. The siege's duration, extending through the winter of 1346 to 1347 and into the following summer, tested English logistical capabilities while demonstrating the kingdom's commitment to establishing permanent continental presence. English supply ships maintained regular communication with the siege force, delivering food, weapons, reinforcements, and construction materials that enabled the besieging army to maintain effective operations throughout the harsh winter months. This logistical achievement reflected the sophisticated administrative systems that supported English military operations, contrasting sharply with the improvised arrangements that characterised most medieval campaigns. The surrender of Calais on August 3, 1347, marked a crucial turning point in Anglo-French relations, establishing English territorial control in northern France that would persist for over 2 centuries. The terms of surrender reflected Edward's determination to create a secure English base, as the entire French population was expelled and replaced by English colonists who would ensure the city's loyalty to the English crown. This population transfer, unprecedented in its scope and systematic implementation, created an English enclave in France that served both military and commercial purposes. The strategic value of Calais extended far beyond its immediate military importance to encompass crucial economic and diplomatic advantages. The city controlled the narrowest crossing point between England and continental Europe, allowing English authorities to regulate trade and monitor French activities in the region. Calais also provided a secure base for English diplomatic missions to continental courts, eliminating the vulnerability that had previously characterised English diplomatic efforts in France. The transformation of Calais into an English stronghold required substantial investment in fortifications and infrastructure that demonstrated Edward's long-term strategic vision. English engineers strengthened the city's walls, expanded the harbour facilities, and constructed administrative buildings that would support permanent English presence. The city became the seat of English administration for all continental territories, housing the bureaucratic apparatus that managed English interests in France, while serving as a symbol of English power and determination. The Black Death's arrival in Europe during 1347 fundamentally altered the strategic context within which Anglo-French conflict developed, creating demographic and economic disruptions that affected military capabilities on both sides. The plague, carried by Genoese trading vessels from the Black Sea region, first appeared in Mediterranean ports before spreading rapidly throughout Western Europe via established trade routes. The disease reached England in 1348 and France shortly thereafter, initiating a demographic catastrophe that would reshape European society for generations. The immediate military impact of the Black Death was to suspend major campaign activities as both kingdoms struggled to maintain basic governmental functions amid massive population losses. English forces in Calais and other continental positions found their garrisons depleted by disease, while French attempts to organise resistance were hampered by the deaths of administrative officials and military commanders. The plague's indiscriminate nature meant that both sides suffered comparable losses, preventing either kingdom from gaining decisive advantage through the other's weakness. The plague's demographic impact proved even more significant for long-term military developments than its immediate effects on campaign activities. Population losses, estimated at between 1/3 and 1/2 of the total population in affected regions, fundamentally altered the manpower resources available for military service. The traditional feudal levies that had provided the bulk of medieval armies were decimated, forcing both English and French military planners to develop new approaches to recruitment and army organisation. Economic disruption caused by the Black Death created additional challenges for military financing and logistics. Agricultural production collapsed in many regions as rural populations died or fled, disrupting the tax revenues that funded military operations. Trade networks that had supported English wool exports and French commercial activities suffered severe disruption, reducing the commercial income that both kingdoms had relied upon to finance their military efforts. The social changes triggered by massive population losses had profound implications for military organisation and recruitment. The deaths of large numbers of peasants and agricultural workers created labour shortages that increased wages and improved working conditions for survivors, making military service less attractive as an alternative to civilian employment. Traditional feudal obligations became increasingly difficult to enforce as landowners struggled to maintain agricultural production with depleted populations. The plague's impact on military technology and tactics proved more subtle but equally significant. The reduced availability of traditional heavy cavalry, whose members had suffered disproportionate losses due to their urban connections and exposure to disease, accelerated the adoption of infantry-based tactical systems that had been demonstrated at Crécy. English tactical innovations, which relied primarily on professional archers and dismounted men-at-arms rather than feudal cavalry, proved more adaptable to the changed demographic conditions than traditional French military organisation. The disruption of established social hierarchies created opportunities for military innovation and social mobility that would characterise warfare throughout the later medieval period. Professional soldiers, whose skills remained valuable despite demographic changes, found increased opportunities for advancement and enrichment. The traditional dominance of hereditary nobility in military affairs began to erode as practical military effectiveness became more important than social status in determining military leadership. The Black Death's religious and psychological impact also influenced military developments by undermining traditional sources of authority and legitimacy. The Church's inability to prevent or explain the plague's devastation weakened clerical influence over military affairs, while the apparent randomness of death reduced confidence in divine support for particular political causes. This psychological transformation contributed to the increasingly secular and pragmatic approach to warfare that characterized the later phases of Anglo-French conflict. The demographic catastrophe of the Black Death created an unexpected diplomatic opportunity that both Edward III and the newly crowned John II of France were eager to exploit. By 1360, both kingdoms had endured over a decade of plague-induced disruption that had fundamentally altered their military capabilities and strategic priorities. The massive population losses had made sustained military campaigns increasingly difficult to organise and finance, while the social upheaval caused by demographic collapse threatened internal stability in both realms. These conditions provided compelling incentives for negotiating a comprehensive peace settlement that would allow both monarchies to address domestic challenges without the constant drain of military expenditure. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed on May 8, 1360, represented the most significant territorial redistribution in Western Europe since the Norman conquest. The negotiations, conducted in the small town of Bretigny near Chartres, involved complex diplomatic manoeuvring that reflected the change balance of power following English victories at Crécy and Poitiers, combined with the capture of John II during the latter engagement. Edward III's negotiating position was strengthened enormously by his possession of the French king, whose ransom provided crucial leverage for extracting territorial concessions that would have been unthinkable under normal diplomatic circumstances. The territorial provisions of Bretigny fundamentally transformed the map of southwestern France in England's favour. Edward III received full sovereignty over an enlarged Aquitaine that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of English-held territory, to include substantial portions of Poitou, Saintonge, and the Limousin. This expanded English domain encompassed approximately one-third of modern France, stretching from the Loire Valley in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, and from the Atlantic coast eastward to the Massif Central. The treaty specifically granted Edward sovereignty rather than feudal tenure over these territories, eliminating the humiliating requirement for English kings to perform homage to French monarchs that had been a constant source of friction since 1066. The strategic implications of these territorial concessions extended far beyond their immediate geographic scope. English control over the expanded Aquitaine provided direct access to the lucrative salt trade from the Bay of Biscay, while encompassing some of France's most productive wine-growing regions. The inclusion of Poitou brought the important city of Poitiers under English administration, creating a strategic corridor that connected English territories in the southwest with potential English interests in the Loire Valley. The eastern extensions into the Limousin provided control over crucial mountain passes and trade routes that connected southwestern France with the Mediterranean regions. The treaty's financial provisions reflected the enormous cost of John II's capture and the desperate French need to secure his release. The ransom, set at 3 million gold écus, represented approximately 4 times the annual revenues of the French crown under normal circumstances. This staggering sum was to be paid in instalments over 6 years, with the first payment of 600,000 écus due immediately upon John's release. The remaining payments would require systematic taxation throughout French territories, creating administrative and financial challenges that would dominate French governmental priorities for the remainder of the decade. The payment schedule established by Bretigny created a complex system of hostages and guarantees designed to ensure French compliance with the treaty's terms. Prominent French nobles, including 2 of John II's sons, were to remain in English custody until the ransom payments were completed. These hostages served both as security for French financial obligations and as symbols of English victory, their continued captivity providing constant reminders of French military defeat and diplomatic humiliation. In exchange for these substantial territorial and financial concessions, Edward III agreed to renounce his claim to the French throne, the assertion that had provided the legal justification for English military campaigns since 1337. This renunciation represented a significant diplomatic concession, as it acknowledged the legitimacy of the Valois dynasty while abandoning the Plantagenet claim that had been based on Edward's descent from Philip IV through his mother Isabella. However, the renunciation was carefully structured to take effect only after all territorial transfers had been completed and verified, providing Edward with continued leverage over French compliance with the treaty's provisions. The implementation of Bretigny's territorial provisions proved far more complex than the treaty's negotiators had anticipated. The transfer of sovereignty over such extensive territories required detailed administrative arrangements that involved thousands of local officials, property holders, and commercial interests. English administrators had to establish governmental structures throughout the enlarged Aquitaine, while French officials were required to withdraw from territories they had administered for generations. The process of transferring records, collecting outstanding revenues, and resolving legal disputes created bureaucratic challenges that persisted for years after the treaty's ratification. Local populations throughout the transferred territories faced difficult choices regarding their allegiance and future prospects. Many Gascon nobles and urban merchants had maintained strong ties to English rule throughout the preceding decades of conflict, viewing English administration as more favourable to their commercial interests than direct French control would be. However, populations in newly transferred regions like Poitou and the Limousin had no comparable experience with English rule and often viewed the territorial transfers with suspicion and resentment. The period of nominal peace following Bretigny's ratification was marked by the emergence of free companies, mercenary bands that had originally been employed by both English and French forces during the active phases of the conflict. These companies, known in French sources as routiers, consisted primarily of professional soldiers who had been displaced by the temporary cessation of major military campaigns. The companies included English archers and men-at-arms who'd served in Edward III's armies, French soldiers who'd been disbanded following military defeats, and international mercenaries from Germany, Italy, and Iberia, who'd been attracted to French service by the prospect of plunder and advancement. The free companies represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of medieval warfare, as they operated independently of traditional feudal obligations and royal authority. Unlike feudal levies, which served for limited periods in fulfillment of specific obligations, or royal armies, which disbanded when campaigns concluded, the free companies maintained permanent military organisation that enabled them to conduct sustained operations regardless of official policy. Their members were professional soldiers whose livelihood depended entirely on military activity, making them unwilling to return to civilian occupations even during periods of official peace. The largest and most notorious of these companies was the Great Company, led initially by Arnaud de Servalet, known as the Archpriest, and later by various other commanders, including Bertrand du Guesclin before his appointment to royal service. The Great Company numbered several thousand men organised into disciplined military units that could conduct complex operations against fortified positions. The company possessed its own administrative structure, including clerks who maintained financial records, chaplains who provided religious services, and specialists who managed the technical aspects of siege warfare. These mercenary bands operated throughout central and southern France, systematically plundering regions that lacked adequate defences while avoiding confrontation with major royal armies. Their tactical approach emphasised mobility and surprise, allowing them to strike vulnerable targets before local authorities could organise effective resistance. The companies typically targeted wealthy monasteries, prosperous merchants' towns, and isolated noble residences that contained valuable goods but lacked strong fortifications or large garrisons. The economic impact of free company activities proved devastating for regions throughout France that were attempting to recover from the demographic and financial disruptions caused by the Black Death. Agricultural production, already reduced by population losses, suffered further disruption as rural communities abandoned their fields to seek protection in fortified towns. Commercial activities were severely hampered by the constant threat of robbery and extortion, while the company's systematic extraction of tribute from vulnerable communities drained resources that were desperately needed for economic recovery. French royal authorities found themselves largely powerless to suppress free company activities due to the kingdom's depleted military resources and financial constraints. The ransom payments required by the Treaty of Bretigny absorbed most available royal revenues, leaving insufficient funds for maintaining large military forces capable of confronting the well-organised mercenary bands. Local nobles whose own military resources had been reduced by plague losses and economic disruption were generally unable to provide effective resistance against companies that often outnumbered and outclassed their hastily assembled forces. The French response to this crisis evolved gradually under the leadership of Charles V, who became king following his father John II's death in 1364. Charles, known as Charles the Wise, had observed the failures of traditional French military approaches during the disasters at Crécy and Poitiers, and he was determined to implement comprehensive reforms that would address both immediate security challenges and long-term strategic requirements. His approach emphasized administrative efficiency, financial reform, and innovative military tactics that departed significantly from the chivalric traditions that had dominated French warfare. Charles V's most significant military innovation was his appointment of Bertrand du Guesclin as Constable of France in 1370. Du Guesclin, a minor Breton noble who had risen through the ranks based on military competence rather than social status, represented a new type of military leader whose authority derived from proven effectiveness rather than hereditary privilege. His background included extensive experience with irregular warfare gained during the Breton War of Succession, where he had developed tactical approaches that emphasized mobility, surprise, and careful selection of engagement conditions. Du Guesclin's military philosophy rejected the traditional French emphasis on decisive battle in favour of systematic attrition that would gradually erode English territorial control without risking catastrophic defeats. His strategy recognised that English tactical superiority in pitched battles made direct confrontation extremely dangerous, while English reliance on relatively small professional armies made them vulnerable to sustained pressure across multiple theatres. This approach required patience and discipline that contrasted sharply with the chivalric traditions that emphasised individual valour and glorious combat. The implementation of Du Guesclin's strategy began with systematic efforts to eliminate free company activities that were destabilising French territories and preventing effective resistance to English occupation. Rather than attempting to destroy these companies through direct military action, Du Guesclin negotiated agreements that redirected their activities toward targets that served French strategic interests. The most notable example was his arrangement with the Great Company to participate in campaigns in Spain, where their military skills could be employed against French enemies while removing their disruptive presence from French territories. The Spanish campaigns of the late 1360s provided crucial training and experience for French forces while generating revenues that helped finance subsequent operations against English positions in France. Du Guesclin's intervention in the Castilian Civil War, supporting Henry of Trastamara against Pedro the Cruel, demonstrated the effectiveness of French irregular tactics while establishing valuable diplomatic relationships with Spanish kingdoms. The campaigns also provided opportunities for French military commanders to gain experience with the tactical innovations that would prove essential for subsequent operations against English forces. Du Guesclin's approach to reconquering English-held territories emphasised systematic reduction of isolated strongpoints, rather than attempts to capture major fortified cities through prolonged sieges. His forces concentrated on eliminating English garrisons from smaller towns and castles that lacked adequate defences or sufficient provisions to withstand extended blockades. This strategy gradually reduced English territorial control by eliminating the network of fortified positions that enabled English administrators to maintain authority over the countryside. The tactical methods employed by du Guesclin's forces reflected careful study of English military innovations, combined with adaptations suited to French strategic requirements. French forces adopted the English practice of using dismounted men-at-arms supported by missile troops, but they emphasized mobility and flexibility rather than the static defensive formations that had characterized English victories at Crécy and Poitiers. French commanders learned to avoid pitched battles where English tactical advantages would be decisive, instead focusing on surprise attacks, night raids, and siege operations that minimized English opportunities to employ their superior archery. The systematic French reconquest accelerated dramatically during the 1370s, as du Guesclin's methods proved increasingly effective against English defensive strategies that had been designed primarily for confronting traditional French cavalry attacks. English garrisons, typically numbering only a few dozen men, found themselves unable to maintain control over hostile populations while facing constant pressure from French irregular forces. The gradual erosion of English territorial control created a cascade effect, as the loss of individual strongpoints made adjacent positions increasingly difficult to defend and supply. Charles V's administrative reforms provided crucial support for du Guesclin's military campaigns by establishing more efficient systems for collecting revenues and organising military resources. The king's financial innovations included new taxation methods that generated substantially increased royal income despite the economic disruptions caused by ongoing warfare. These revenues enabled the maintenance of larger professional military forces that could conduct sustained operations without relying on feudal levies, whose service obligations were limited in duration and scope. The modernisation of French fortifications represented another crucial element of Charles V's comprehensive military reforms. The king invested heavily in strengthening defensive positions throughout French territories, incorporating lessons learned from English siege techniques while adapting fortification designs to the specific requirements of French defensive strategy. These improved fortifications provided secure bases for French irregular operations, while denying English forces the fortified positions they required to maintain territorial control. The systematic French reconquest under Charles V and Bertrand du Guesclin had restored French control over most territories lost at Bretigny, but the military innovations and administrative reforms that enabled this recovery could not address the fundamental political instability that would soon engulf both kingdoms. The death of Charles V in 1380 brought his 12-year-old son Charles VI to the throne under a regency that immediately faced challenges from competing noble factions seeking to control royal policy. The young king's subsequent descent into madness, beginning with his first major episode in 1392, created a power vacuum that would be exploited by ambitious nobles whose rivalries would ultimately provide England with unprecedented opportunities for renewed continental intervention. In England, the political crisis that culminated in Richard II's deposition reflected deeper tensions between royal authority and noble privilege that had been building throughout the later 14th century. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 had demonstrated the fragility of social order in the aftermath of the Black Death, as rural populations demanded fundamental changes in labour obligations and legal status. The revolt's immediate trigger was the implementation of poll taxes designed to finance continued military operations in France, but the underlying grievances reflected broader social transformations that had been accelerated by demographic collapse and economic disruption. The rebellion's most dramatic moment came with Wat Tyler's confrontation with Richard II at Smithfield on June 15, 1381, where the young king's apparent courage in facing the rebel leader temporarily diffused the crisis. However, the revolt's aftermath revealed the limited effectiveness of traditional responses to social upheaval, as government efforts to restore pre-plague labour conditions proved largely unsuccessful. The economic forces that had driven rural populations to rebellion remained largely unchanged, creating ongoing tensions that would influence English domestic politics throughout Richard's reign. Richard II's increasingly autocratic behaviour during the 1390s reflected his determination to establish royal authority that could not be challenged by noble opposition or popular uprising. His creation of new noble titles for political allies, his reliance on a narrow circle of court favourites, and his systematic efforts to eliminate potential rivals generated widespread resentment among established noble families who viewed these policies as threats to their traditional privileges. The king's quarrel with Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, over the inheritance of John of Gaunt's estates provided the immediate cause for the political crisis of 1399. But the underlying issues involved fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority and noble rights. Henry Bolingbroke's invasion of England in July 1399 succeeded with remarkable speed due to the widespread opposition to Richard II's policies among both nobles and common people. Richard's absence in Ireland, attempting to suppress rebellion there, left England largely undefended against Bolingbroke's small invasion force. The rapid collapse of royal resistance demonstrated the extent to which Richard had alienated potential supporters, as most major nobles either actively supported Bolingbroke or remained neutral during the brief campaign that culminated in Richard's capture and subsequent deposition. The establishment of the Lancastrian dynasty under Henry IV created new opportunities for renewed English intervention in France, but also imposed significant constraints due to the questionable legitimacy of Henry's claim to the throne. Henry's usurpation had been justified primarily through parliamentary approval and popular support rather than clear hereditary right, making his position vulnerable to challenges from both domestic rivals and foreign enemies. The persistence of Richard II's supporters, combined with periodic rebellions by Welsh and Scottish forces, forced Henry to focus primarily on domestic security rather than continental adventures during the early years of his reign. The outbreak of civil war in France between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions provided the strategic opportunity that would enable Henry V to achieve unprecedented English success in continental warfare. The conflict originated in the rivalry between Louis of Orleans, brother of the mad King Charles VI, and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, whose competing claims for control over royal policy reflected deeper divisions within French noble society. Louis's assassination in 1407, ordered by John the Fearless, transformed political rivalry into blood feud that would dominate French politics for the following 3 decades. The Armagnac faction, led by Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, and later by Charles of Orleans, represented the traditional French nobility's resistance to Burgundian attempts to control royal policy through manipulation of the Mad King. The Armagnacs controlled much of southern and central France, including the crucial territories around Paris, and maintained the loyalty of most royal administrative officials who viewed Burgundian policies as threats to royal authority. Their military strength was concentrated in professional forces that had been developed during the successful campaigns against English territorial control during the 1370s and 1380s. The Burgundian faction, centred on John the Fearless's extensive territories in eastern France and the Low Countries, possessed significant advantages in terms of financial resources and international connections. Burgundian control over Flemish commercial centres provided access to substantial revenues from the cloth trade, while their territory's strategic location enabled them to forge alliances with English forces and German princes who opposed French influence in the Rhine Valley. The Burgundians also benefited from popular support in Paris, where urban populations viewed them as protectors against Armagnac taxation and military requisitions. The intensity of French factional conflict created conditions that were ideally suited to English intervention, as both sides proved willing to negotiate alliances with England in order to gain decisive advantages over their domestic rivals. Henry V's diplomatic initiatives during the early years of his reign exploited these divisions by maintaining simultaneous negotiations with both factions, extracting concessions from each while avoiding firm commitments that would limit English strategic flexibility. This approach enabled Henry to assess French military capabilities while preparing for the comprehensive invasion that would restore English territorial control in France. Henry V's character and military experience made him uniquely qualified to exploit the opportunities created by French civil war. Unlike his father, whose reign had been dominated by efforts to establish domestic legitimacy, Henry possessed unquestioned hereditary authority that enabled him to pursue aggressive foreign policies without facing significant domestic opposition. His participation in campaigns against Welsh rebels during his youth had provided crucial experience with irregular warfare, while his involvement in English domestic politics had demonstrated his ability to manage complex diplomatic relationships and competing political interests. The English army that assembled for Henry's 1415 invasion represented the culmination of military innovations that had been developing since Edward III's victories in the 14th century. The core of Henry's force consisted of approximately 2,000 men-at-arms, professional soldiers whose equipment and training reflected decades of tactical refinement since Crécy and Poitiers. These men-at-arms were supported by roughly 6,000 longbowmen, drawn primarily from regions where archery skills remained highly developed despite the social changes that had followed the Black Death. The composition of Henry's army reflected significant changes in English military organisation that had occurred during the intervening decades. The traditional feudal levies that had provided substantial portions of earlier English armies had been largely replaced by contracted, professional forces whose service was based on written agreements specifying terms of employment, rates of pay, and duration of service. This contractual system, known as bastard feudalism, enabled English commanders to maintain more reliable military forces while providing individual soldiers with clearer legal protections and more predictable compensation. English tactical doctrine had evolved considerably since the 14th century victories, incorporating lessons learned from French military innovations while adapting to changed strategic circumstances. The emphasis on defensive archery that had characterised earlier English successes was supplemented by increased attention to offensive operations, particularly siege warfare and rapid movement that could exploit enemy weaknesses before effective resistance could be organised. English commanders had also developed more sophisticated approaches to logistics and supply that enabled sustained operations far from English bases. The English landing at Harfleur on August 13, 1415, marked the beginning of a campaign that would fundamentally transform the balance of power in Western Europe. Harfleur's strategic importance derived from its position controlling the mouth of the Seine River, which provided the primary water route to Paris and the heart of French royal territory. English control of Harfleur would enable subsequent operations along the Seine Valley while denying French forces access to one of their most important commercial and military ports. The siege of Harfleur demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of English military capabilities at the beginning of Henry's continental campaigns. English forces successfully invested the town and systematically reduced its defensive capabilities through sustained bombardment and coordinated assault operations. However, the siege required over 5 weeks to complete, during which English forces suffered significant casualties from disease and French defensive action. The delay also enabled French forces to organise resistance to subsequent English operations, while demonstrating that even relatively minor French strongholds could impose substantial costs on English attackers. The capture of Harfleur on September 22, 1415, provided Henry with his first major success in France, but also created strategic dilemmas regarding the continuation of his campaign. The siege had consumed much of the campaigning season while reducing English military strength through casualties and disease. French forces were mobilising throughout northern France under the leadership of Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, creating the prospect of major battle under conditions that might not favour English tactical methods. Henry's decision to march across northern France to Calais reflected his determination to demonstrate English military superiority while avoiding the appearance of retreat that would damage English prestige and encourage French resistance. The English march from Harfleur toward Calais covered approximately 150 miles through territory that was largely hostile to English interests and increasingly dominated by French military forces seeking to intercept Henry's army. The route took English forces through the Somme Valley, where they encountered unexpected resistance at river crossings that had been fortified by French advance guards. These delays forced Henry's army to deviate from their planned route while consuming precious time and resources that reduced their strategic flexibility. French strategy during this phase of the campaign reflected careful planning by commanders who had studied English tactical methods and were determined to avoid the mistakes that had led to disasters at Crécy and Poitiers. Rather than attempting immediate battle against English forces in defensive positions, French commanders planned to force Henry's army to attack prepared French positions or to exhaust English resources through prolonged manoeuvring that would eventually create favourable conditions for French victory. This approach required patience and discipline that represented significant departures from traditional French military culture. The converging armies met near the village of Agincourt on October the 25th, 1415, under circumstances that initially appeared to favour French tactical objectives. The French army, numbering between 20,000 and 25,000 men, significantly outnumbered Henry's force of approximately 6,000 English soldiers. The battlefield itself was a narrow corridor between wooded areas that limited opportunities for English tactical manoeuvring, while concentrating French numerical advantages in a relatively small area. Recent rainfall had created muddy conditions that would impede cavalry movement while making rapid infantry advance extremely difficult. The French battle formation reflected lessons learned from previous defeats while attempting to neutralise English archery through tactical innovations that had not been tested in major engagements. The French vanguard consisted of heavily armoured men-at-arms fighting on foot, positioned to absorb English arrow fire while advancing steadily toward English positions. Behind this infantry force, French cavalry units waited to exploit gaps created by the initial assault, while crossbow units positioned on the flanks provided missile support for the advancing infantry. The French tactical plan assumed that concentrated infantry attack could penetrate English defensive positions despite arrow fire, based on the calculation that heavily armoured men-at-arms could sustain sufficient casualties to reach English lines, where close combat would favour French numerical superiority. This approach represented a sophisticated response to English tactical innovations, but it underestimated the cumulative effect of English archery on heavily armoured infantry advancing across difficult terrain. The Battle of Agincourt unfolded as a devastating demonstration of English tactical superiority that exceeded even the victories at Crécy and Poitiers in terms of the disparity between English and French casualties. The engagement began when French cavalry units attempted to disperse English archers positioned on the flanks of Henry's formation. These attacks failed completely, as English longbowmen systematically eliminated French horses while inflicting severe casualties on dismounted knights who found themselves trapped in the muddy field between the opposing armies. The main French infantry assault encountered identical problems on a much larger scale, as thousands of heavily armoured men-at-arms attempted to advance across the muddy battlefield under constant arrow fire from multiple directions. The weight of French armour, designed to provide protection against conventional weapons, became a fatal liability in the muddy conditions, as fallen soldiers were unable to rise, and continuing French advance created increasingly dense concentrations of troops that provided ideal targets for English archers. The systematic destruction of French military leadership during the battle had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Charles d'Albret died early in the engagement, eliminating French command coordination and leaving individual units to fight without effective central direction. The deaths of numerous dukes, counts, and other prominent nobles eliminated much of the experienced military leadership that would be required for subsequent French resistance to English occupation. Among the notable casualties were Charles d'Albret himself, Duke Antoine of Brabant, Duke Edward of Bar, and Count Frederick of Vaudemont, representing a catastrophic loss of military expertise and political authority. The capture of prominent French nobles during the battle's aftermath created additional advantages for English strategic planning, as these prisoners could be used for diplomatic leverage, while their ransoms provided substantial revenues for subsequent English operations. The most significant captives included Charles of Orléans, Duke of Bourbon, and Marshal Boucicault, whose imprisonment removed key leaders from French resistance efforts while demonstrating English military dominance to potential allies and enemies throughout Europe. Henry's controversial order to execute French prisoners during the battle reflected his concern about the security of his position rather than deliberate cruelty, as reports of renewed French attacks threatened to overwhelm English forces who were already engaged in guarding substantial numbers of captives. The execution order was rescinded once the tactical situation stabilised, but the incident demonstrated the extreme pressures that characterised medieval battlefield conditions and the difficult decisions that commanders faced during fluid combat situations. The aftermath of Agincourt revealed the broader strategic implications of English tactical superiority for the continuation of Anglo-French conflict. French military capabilities had been devastated not only through immediate casualties, but also through the elimination of experienced commanders and the psychological trauma inflicted on surviving French forces. The battle's outcome encouraged English allies throughout Europe while discouraging potential French supporters who questioned the ability of French forces to resist English military pressure effectively. Henry's systematic conquest of Normandy between 1417 and 1419 demonstrated the strategic vision that distinguished his approach from earlier English continental campaigns. Rather than attempting to hold isolated strongpoints that could be eliminated through French siege operations, Henry implemented a comprehensive strategy that established English territorial control through methodical reduction of French defensive positions combined with administrative arrangements that secured the loyalty of local populations. The English invasion of Normandy began with the capture of Caen on September 4th, 1417, following a brief siege that demonstrated the effectiveness of English combined arms tactics against traditional fortifications. The city's rapid fall provided Henry with a secure base for subsequent operations, while demonstrating to Norman populations that resistance to English forces would prove futile. Henry's treatment of Caen's inhabitants, which balanced firm control with protection of civilian lives and property, established patterns of English administration that would characterise the occupation of Normandy throughout the following years. Henry's siege techniques reflected significant innovations in medieval warfare that combined traditional blockade methods with systematic destruction of defensive capabilities through concentrated bombardment. English forces employed early cannon alongside traditional siege engines, creating unprecedented levels of destructive capability that could breach even the strongest fortifications within relatively short periods. The psychological impact of these weapons proved as significant as their physical effects, as defending garrisons often surrendered rather than enduring prolonged bombardment that would inevitably result in their positions becoming untenable. The systematic nature of Henry's Norman conquest involved careful attention to administrative arrangements that would ensure long-term English control over conquered territories. English officials replaced French administrators throughout the region, while English colonists were encouraged to settle in Norman towns and countryside. These population transfers, combined with the establishment of English legal and commercial systems, created conditions that would enable sustained English presence even in the face of potential French attempts at reconquest. The Siege of Rouen, beginning in July 1418, represented the culmination of Henry's Norman campaign and demonstrated the sophisticated siege warfare techniques that had been developed through years of continental operations. Rouen's strategic importance as the capital of Normandy and its position controlling the lower Seine Valley made its capture essential for consolidating English territorial control. The city's strong fortifications and large garrison required English forces to implement a comprehensive blockade that prevented all supplies from reaching the defenders while systematically reducing their defensive capabilities. The duration of Rouen's siege, extending through the harsh winter of 1418 to 1419, tested both English logistical capabilities and French determination to resist English occupation. English supply networks maintained effective support for the besieging army despite the challenges of winter weather and French attempts to disrupt English communications. The gradual exhaustion of Rouen's food supplies created increasingly desperate conditions within the city, ultimately forcing the garrison to surrender on January 19, 1419, after nearly 6 months of resistance. The fall of Rouen completed English conquest of Normandy while providing Henry with a territorial base necessary for advancing toward Paris and the heart of French royal power. English control over the Seine Valley enabled direct communication between Norman territories and English positions around Calais, creating a continuous zone of English influence across northern France. This territorial consolidation represented the most substantial English continental presence since the height of Plantagenet power during the 12th century. The Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21, 1420, represented the pinnacle of English success in the 100 Years' War and established the legal framework for a dual monarchy that would unite the crowns of England and France under Lancastrian rule. The negotiations leading to this extraordinary agreement reflected the desperate situation of the Armagnac faction following their military defeats and the calculation by John the Fearless that alliance with England offered the best prospect for achieving his political objectives in France. The treaty's provisions fundamentally altered the succession to the French throne by recognising Henry V as heir to Charles VI, while disinheriting the Dauphin Charles, who was declared illegitimate and excluded from royal succession. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois, Charles VI's daughter, provided additional legitimacy for English claims while creating the prospect that future English kings would possess unquestioned hereditary rights to both crowns. The agreement specified that Henry would serve as regent of France during Charles VI's lifetime, exercising royal authority while respecting the theoretical continued reign of the Mad King. The territorial arrangements established by Troyes confirmed English sovereignty over all conquered territories while providing legal justification for continued English expansion into regions that remained under Armagnac control. The treaty recognised English authority over Normandy, Aquitaine, and other territories that had been conquered through military action, while establishing the legal framework for incorporating additional French territories as English forces advanced toward complete control over the kingdom. The administrative implications of the dual monarchy created unprecedented challenges for English governmental systems that had been designed to manage a single kingdom rather than coordinate rule over multiple realms. English officials were required to establish parallel administrative structures in France while maintaining effective coordination between English and French governmental systems. The complexity of these arrangements required substantial expansion of English bureaucratic capabilities and the development of new approaches to managing cross-channel communications and coordination. The death of Henry V at Vincennes on August 31, 1422, at the age of 35, created an immediate succession crisis that would fundamentally undermine the dual monarchy established by the Treaty of Troyes. The king's sudden demise from dysentery, contracted during the Siege of Meaux, left the English crown to his 9-month-old son Henry VI, whose minority would require a regency lasting well over a decade. This unprecedented situation placed enormous strain on English administrative systems that had been designed around the personal authority of an adult monarch, while simultaneously providing French resistance movements with opportunities to challenge English territorial control throughout occupied France. The regency arrangements established following Henry V's death reflected the complex political realities of governing two kingdoms through a council system rather than direct royal authority. John, Duke of Bedford, Henry V's younger brother, assumed responsibility for governing English territories in France as Regent of France, while Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, served as protector of England during the young king's minority. This division of authority created potential conflicts between English domestic interests and continental strategic requirements, as the two regents possessed different priorities and often disagreed about resource allocation and military strategy. Bedford's position as Regent of France required him to maintain English control over vast territories that remained fundamentally hostile to English rule, despite military conquest and administrative reorganisation. The Norman territories, conquered through Henry V's systematic campaigns, contained populations that had been subjected to English administration for less than 5 years and retained strong cultural and economic ties to the French kingdom. The longer established English territories in Aquitaine faced different challenges, as local populations had developed complex relationships with English rule over centuries, but remained vulnerable to French diplomatic and military pressure. The financial resources required to maintain English garrisons throughout occupied France created enormous strain on English royal revenues that had already been stretched by the costs of Henry V's conquest campaigns. English forces in France numbered approximately 10,000 men distributed among dozens of fortified positions, each requiring regular pay, supplies, and equipment maintenance. The annual cost of maintaining these forces exceeded £200,000, representing nearly half of total English royal income under normal circumstances. This financial burden proved particularly problematic during a minority, when royal authority was weakened and domestic political opposition could more easily challenge taxation policies. Bedford's administrative capabilities proved crucial for maintaining English territorial control during the early years of the Regency. His experience serving under Henry V in France had provided him with detailed knowledge of English governmental systems in occupied territories, while his personal relationships with English commanders and administrators enabled him to maintain effective coordination despite the absence of direct royal authority. Bedford's diplomatic skills also proved essential for managing relationships with Burgundian allies, whose continued support remained vital for English strategic success. The Burgundian alliance, formalised through Bedford's marriage to Anne of Burgundy in 1423, represented the cornerstone of English strategy for maintaining territorial control in France. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, controlled extensive territories in eastern France and the Low Countries that provided crucial strategic depth for English positions, while offering access to substantial military and financial resources. Burgundian forces had played decisive roles in English victories during Henry's campaigns, while Burgundian territories provided secure bases and supply routes that enabled English forces to operate effectively throughout northern France. However, the Burgundian alliance contained inherent instabilities that became increasingly apparent during the Regency period. Philip the Good's primary objective remained the expansion of Burgundian territorial control and political influence rather than the permanent establishment of English rule in France. His support for English interests depended on continued English military success, and the perception that alliance with England served Burgundian strategic objectives better than accommodation with French resistance forces. The minority of Henry VI created uncertainties about English capabilities and long-term commitment that made Philip increasingly receptive to alternative diplomatic arrangements. The emergence of organised French resistance under the Dauphin Charles, who had established his court at Bourges following his exclusion from the succession by the Treaty of Troyes, presented growing challenges to English territorial control throughout central and southern France. Charles's supporters, known as Armagnacs, maintained control over substantial territories south of the Loire River, while conducting irregular warfare against English positions in occupied regions. The Armagnac forces lacked the resources to challenge English control through conventional military campaigns, but their persistent harassment of English supply lines and isolated garrisons gradually eroded English administrative effectiveness. The psychological impact of prolonged English occupation on French populations created conditions that increasingly favoured resistance movements despite English efforts to establish legitimate governmental authority. English administrators had implemented legal and commercial systems designed to provide effective governance while respecting local customs and privileges. However, the fundamental reality of foreign occupation remained apparent through the presence of English garrisons, the appointment of English officials to key administrative positions, and the systematic extraction of revenues to support English military operations. French cultural identity had been strengthened rather than weakened by English occupation, as populations throughout occupied territories developed increasingly sophisticated networks for maintaining French traditions and resisting English cultural influence. The Catholic Church played a particularly important role in preserving French identity, as most clergy remained loyal to French interests despite English political control. Religious services, educational activities, and charitable works provided opportunities for maintaining French cultural practices, while creating organisational structures that could support resistance activities when circumstances permitted. The economic disruption caused by prolonged warfare and military occupation created additional sources of popular resentment against English rule. Agricultural production throughout occupied territories remained substantially below pre-war levels due to the destruction of crops and livestock during military campaigns, the displacement of rural populations, and the constant demands for supplies to support English garrisons. Commercial activities were similarly disrupted by the breakdown of traditional trade networks, the imposition of English customs and taxation systems, and the general insecurity that characterised regions under military occupation. The Siege of Orléans, beginning in October 1428, represented Bedford's most ambitious attempt to extend English territorial control into central France, while eliminating the primary stronghold of French resistance forces. Orléans occupied a crucial strategic position controlling the Loire River crossing that provided the primary route between northern France, where English forces were concentrated, and the southern territories that remained under Armagnac control. The city's capture would effectively divide French resistance territories, while providing English forces with a secure base for operations against Bourges and other centres of Armagnac power. The English forces that invested Orléans numbered approximately 5,000 men under the command of Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, representing one of the largest English armies assembled since Henry V's conquest campaigns. The besieging force included substantial numbers of experienced soldiers who had served in previous French campaigns, supported by artillery units equipped with the latest siege weapons available to English forces. The army's composition reflected English confidence that conventional siege techniques would prove adequate for reducing Orléans, despite the city's strong fortifications and determined garrison. Orléans' defensive capabilities had been substantially strengthened during the preceding years through systematic improvements to the city's walls, towers, and gates that incorporated lessons learned from English siege techniques during Henry V's campaigns. The fortifications included multiple defensive lines that would require English forces to conduct separate siege operations against each position, while the city's position on the Loire River enabled continued communication with Armagnac territories to the south. The garrison, commanded by Jean de Dunois, numbered approximately 2,400 men, including experienced soldiers and local militia who possessed detailed knowledge of the city's defensive systems. The death of the Earl of Salisbury on November 3, 1428, from wounds received during the siege's opening phases, eliminated English command coordination and created leadership disputes that weakened the effectiveness of subsequent operations. Salisbury's replacement by William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, represented a significant reduction in English command capabilities, As Suffolk lacked Salisbury's extensive experience with siege warfare and his established relationships with English field commanders. The change in leadership also created uncertainties about English strategic objectives that enabled the defenders to adapt their defensive preparations to changing tactical circumstances. The English siege strategy emphasised systematic reduction of Orleans' defensive capabilities through coordinated bombardment and assault operations that had proved successful during previous campaigns. English artillery units established firing positions that could target crucial sections of the city's walls, while English infantry forces constructed siege works designed to enable close approach to defensive positions. However, the strength of Orleans' fortifications and the determination of its defenders prevented English forces from achieving the rapid success that characterised earlier siege operations. The prolonged nature of the siege created logistical challenges that gradually weakened English capabilities while strengthening French determination to resist English expansion. English supply lines extending from Normandy and other occupied territories became increasingly vulnerable to French irregular attacks that disrupted the flow of food, ammunition, and reinforcements to the besieging army. The winter of 1428 to 1429 proved particularly difficult for English forces, as harsh weather conditions combined with supply shortages to reduce military effectiveness, while disease outbreaks depleted English manpower. French relief efforts during the siege demonstrated the growing effectiveness of Armagnac military organisation under leaders who had learned to exploit English tactical weaknesses while avoiding direct confrontation with English forces in favourable defensive positions. French commanders employed mobile tactics that emphasised surprise attacks against English supply convoys and isolated detachments, gradually reducing English capabilities without risking major battles that might result in catastrophic defeats. These operations required careful coordination between regular Armagnac forces and local populations, who provided intelligence and logistical support for French military activities. The appearance of Joan of Arc at the court of Charles VII in February 1429 represented a psychological turning point in French resistance efforts that would have consequences extending far beyond immediate military considerations. The young peasant woman's claims of divine visions directing her to drive English forces from France and secure Charles's coronation at Reims provided French resistance movements with a powerful symbolic focus that transcended traditional political and military leadership. Her arrival at Chinon and subsequent recognition by Charles created unprecedented popular enthusiasm for resistance activities throughout territories under both English occupation and Armagnac control. Joan's impact on French military capabilities proved as significant as her psychological influence, as her presence with French relief forces attempting to break the siege of Orléans transformed the strategic calculations of both French and English commanders. French forces that had previously avoided direct confrontation with English armies became willing to risk major engagements, while English commanders found themselves facing unprecedented challenges from French forces whose morale and determination had been dramatically enhanced by Joan's participation in their operations. The transformation of popular attitudes toward English occupation became increasingly apparent throughout occupied territories during early 1429, as reports of Joan's activities spread through informal networks that English authorities proved unable to control or suppress. Rural populations that had previously accepted English administration with resigned compliance began demonstrating active resistance through various forms of non-cooperation, intelligence gathering for French forces, and direct support for Armagnac military operations. Urban populations similarly showed increasing hostility toward English officials and garrison forces, creating security challenges that required English commanders to divert substantial resources from offensive operations to maintaining control over supposedly pacified territories. The breakdown of English intelligence networks throughout occupied France reflected the broader deterioration of English administrative control as popular resistance movements gained momentum and coordination. English officials who had previously relied on local informants and collaborative administrators found themselves increasingly isolated from accurate information about French military activities and popular attitudes. This intelligence failure proved particularly dangerous for English military operations, as commanders lacked reliable information about French force movements and strategic intentions at the precise moment when French capabilities were being enhanced through improved morale and coordination. The Siege of Orleans thus represented far more than a conventional military operation, serving instead as the focal point for a fundamental transformation in the nature of Anglo-French conflict. The prolonged English failure to capture the city demonstrated the limitations of English military capabilities when faced with determined resistance supported by popular enthusiasm, while the emergence of Joan of Arc provided French resistance movements with unprecedented symbolic and practical leadership. The siege's continuation into 1429 created conditions that would enable French forces to achieve their first major military success against English forces since the disasters of the early 15th century, fundamentally altering the strategic balance that had favoured English interests since Agincourt. The theological examination of Joan of Arc at Poitiers during March 1429 represented far more than mere verification of her claimed divine mission. It constituted a sophisticated political manoeuvre designed to provide Charles VII with the religious legitimacy necessary to challenge English occupation and Burgundian collaboration. The panel of ecclesiastical authorities, including bishops, theologians and canon lawyers, subjected Joan to intensive questioning about her visions, her knowledge of Christian doctrine, and her specific plans for military action against English forces. Their eventual approval transformed a peasant girl's mystical claims into official church sanction for renewed French resistance, providing Charles with the divine authorization that medieval kingship required for legitimate authority. Joan's physical appearance during her arrival at Chinon had deliberately emphasized her transformation from rural peasant to divinely appointed military leader. She'd cut her hair short in masculine fashion, adopted male clothing suitable for military campaign, and carried herself with the confident bearing of someone convinced of her sacred mission. Contemporary accounts describe her as approximately 17 years old, of medium height with a strong, compact build that suggested the physical labour of her rural background. Her dark hair framed a face that observers consistently described as determined rather than beautiful, with penetrating eyes that seemed to reflect absolute certainty in her divine calling. The military equipment provided to Joan following her acceptance by Charles VII reflected both practical considerations for campaign effectiveness and symbolic requirements for her role as a divinely inspired leader. Her armour, specially commissioned from Milan armourers renowned for their craftsmanship, consisted of a complete harness of polished steel plates that provided maximum protection while allowing the mobility necessary for active battlefield leadership. The armour's bright finish created a striking visual impression that enhanced Joan's symbolic impact on both French and English forces, while its superior construction offered genuine protection against the weapons she would face during siege and battle operations. Joan's standard, created according to her specific instructions based on her claimed visions, bore the image of Christ in majesty flanked by the archangels Michael and Gabriel, with the inscription Jesus Maria prominently displayed. This banner served multiple functions during her military campaigns, providing a rallying point for French forces while proclaiming the religious nature of her mission to both allies and enemies. The standard's presence on battlefields transformed military engagements into religious crusades, fundamentally altering the psychological dynamics of combat between French and English forces. The relief army that assembled at Blois during April 1429 under Joan's spiritual leadership represented a dramatic transformation in French military capabilities and popular enthusiasm for resistance against English occupation. The force numbered approximately 4,000 men, including experienced soldiers who had served in previous Armagnac campaigns, alongside volunteers drawn from throughout central France by reports of Joan's divine mission. The army's composition reflected unprecedented cooperation between professional military units and popular militias, creating a combined force that possessed both tactical expertise and religious fervour. French military preparations for the relief of Orléans incorporated tactical innovations designed to exploit English weaknesses while maximising the psychological impact of Joan's presence. French commanders had studied English siege techniques extensively, developing countermeasures that emphasised mobility and surprise, rather than direct confrontation with English forces in prepared positions. The relief strategy involved multiple coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm English defensive capabilities while preventing English commanders from concentrating their forces effectively against any single French thrust. The approach march to Orléans revealed the extent to which Joan's presence had transformed popular attitudes throughout territories under English occupation. Rural populations along the route provided intelligence about English troop movements, supplied provisions for French forces, and offered guides familiar with local terrain and defensive positions. This popular support created unprecedented advantages for French military operations, as English forces found themselves operating in increasingly hostile territory, where their movements were constantly monitored and reported to French commanders. The entry of French relief forces into Orléans on April 29, 1429, marked the beginning of a series of coordinated attacks that would demonstrate the transformed capabilities of French resistance forces under Joan's inspiration. The operation required careful coordination between forces inside the city and the approaching relief army, with precise timing necessary to prevent English forces from defeating each French contingent separately. The successful link-up between garrison and relief forces provided French commanders with sufficient strength to challenge English control over the siege works that had surrounded Orléans for over 6 months. The assault on the English fortification known as Les Tourelles on May 7, 1429, represented the climactic engagement that would break the English siege and establish Joan's military reputation throughout Europe. The fortified position controlled the bridge approach to Orléans and represented the strongest point in the English siege works, with multiple defensive lines protected by artillery and experienced English soldiers. French forces attacking this position faced the prospect of advancing across open ground under concentrated English fire, followed by close combat against defenders protected by strong fortifications. Joan's role during the assault combined practical military leadership with powerful symbolic presence that inspired French forces to unprecedented levels of determination and courage. She positioned herself prominently during the attack, carrying her standard and exhorting French soldiers to maintain their advance despite English resistance. When an English arrow struck her shoulder during the assault, she briefly withdrew to have the wound treated before returning to lead the final phases of the attack, demonstrating the physical courage that enhanced her credibility as a divinely appointed leader. The capture of Les Tourelles, after hours of intense fighting, eliminated the key position in English siege works, while inflicting severe casualties on English forces that had been considered among the most experienced and reliable in English service. The English commander, William Glasdale, died during the fighting along with numerous other experienced soldiers whose loss significantly weakened English military capabilities in the Loire Valley. The psychological impact of this defeat on English forces proved even more significant than the immediate tactical consequences, as it demonstrated that English defensive positions could be overcome by determined French attacks. The English withdrawal from Orléans on May 8, 1429, marked the first major English retreat since the beginning of Henry V's conquest campaigns and signalled a fundamental shift in the strategic balance between English and French forces. The abandonment of the siege represented not merely a tactical setback, but a strategic disaster that exposed the limitations of English military capabilities when faced with determined resistance supported by popular enthusiasm. The retreat also demonstrated that English forces could no longer maintain territorial control through the network of fortified positions that had enabled their occupation of northern France. The immediate aftermath of Orléans revealed the broader implications of Joan's success for French resistance movements throughout occupied territories. Reports of the English defeat spread rapidly through informal networks, inspiring increased resistance activities and popular demonstrations against English administration. Rural populations that had previously provided supplies and labour for English forces began actively supporting French military operations, while urban populations in occupied cities demonstrated growing hostility toward English officials and garrison forces. Charles VII's decision to authorise an immediate campaign toward Reims reflected his recognition that Joan's success at Orléans had created unprecedented opportunities for challenging English territorial control and establishing legitimate royal authority. The march to Reims represented far more than a symbolic gesture. It constituted a strategic offensive designed to demonstrate French military capabilities while securing the coronation that would provide Charles with the religious legitimacy necessary for effective kingship. The campaign required French forces to advance through territories that had been under English or Burgundian control for years, testing both military capabilities and popular support for French resistance. The Loire campaign that preceded the march to Hessin demonstrated the transformed effectiveness of French military operations under Joan's leadership and the tactical innovations that had been developed through careful study of English methods. French forces systematically eliminated English strongholds along the Loire Valley through coordinated siege operations that combined traditional blockade techniques with aggressive assault tactics designed to minimise the time required for each operation. The rapid capture of Jargeau on June 12, 1429, followed by victories at Meung-sur-Loire and Beaugency, eliminated English territorial control throughout the region while providing French forces with secure bases for subsequent operations. The Battle of Patay on June 18, 1429, represented the first major French victory in open battle since the disasters of the early 15th century and demonstrated that French forces could defeat English armies even under conditions that favoured English tactical methods. The engagement occurred when French cavalry units surprised an English force that was attempting to establish defensive positions near the village of Patay. The English army, commanded by John Talbot and John Fastolf, numbered approximately 2,500 men, including experienced longbowmen and men-at-arms who had participated in previous English victories. The tactical circumstances at Patay prevented English forces from implementing the defensive archery tactics that had proved so effective at Agincourt and earlier engagements. French cavalry, led by Jean de Dunois and Etienne de Vignoles, struck the English force before it could establish proper defensive positions, creating chaos that prevented coordinated English resistance. The speed of the French attack eliminated the time necessary for English archers to establish effective fields of fire, while the surprise nature of the engagement prevented English commanders from organising their forces according to established tactical doctrine. French tactical execution at Patay reflected sophisticated understanding of English military methods combined with innovative approaches designed to neutralise English advantages while exploiting their weaknesses. French commanders had recognised that English tactical superiority depended on their ability to choose engagement conditions and establish prepared defensive positions before battle commenced. By forcing immediate combat through surprise attacks, French forces could prevent English armies from implementing their preferred tactical systems while creating conditions that favoured French numerical superiority and cavalry effectiveness. The casualties inflicted on English forces at Patay exceeded 2,000 men, including most of the experienced soldiers and commanders who had formed the core of English military strength in the Loire Valley. John Talbot's capture eliminated one of England's most experienced field commanders, while the deaths of numerous other English officers significantly weakened English leadership capabilities throughout central France. The psychological impact of this decisive defeat proved even more significant than the immediate military consequences, as it demonstrated that English forces could be defeated even in conventional battle under appropriate circumstances. The march to Reims during June and July 1429 represented the culmination of Joan's military achievements, and demonstrated the extent to which French popular support had been transformed by her successes against English forces. The route from the Loire Valley to Reims passed through territories that had been under Burgundian or English control for years, requiring French forces to advance through potentially hostile territory while maintaining secure communications with their bases in central France. The enthusiastic reception that French forces received throughout this region revealed the extent to which popular attitudes had shifted in favour of French resistance. The systematic submission of fortified towns along the route to Reims demonstrated that English and Burgundian territorial control had become fundamentally unstable in the face of French military success and popular enthusiasm. Cities that had been considered secure bases for English or Burgundian forces opened their gates to French armies without resistance, while local populations provided supplies and intelligence that facilitated French operations. This transformation reflected not only military considerations, but also the psychological impact of Joan's victories on populations that had begun to believe in the possibility of French liberation from foreign occupation. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral on July 17, 1429, represented the symbolic culmination of Joan's mission and provided the French monarchy with the religious legitimacy that had been denied through English occupation of traditional coronation sites. The ceremony followed established traditions that dated back to Clovis and Charlemagne, emphasising the sacred nature of French kingship, while specifically rejecting the legitimacy of English claims to the French throne. Joan's prominent position during the ceremony, standing beside the newly crowned king with her standard displayed, symbolically linked her divine mission with Charles's royal authority. The political implications of Charles's coronation extended far beyond ceremonial considerations to encompass fundamental questions about legitimate authority and popular allegiance throughout France. The ceremony at Reims directly challenged the legal basis for English occupation established by the Treaty of Troyes, providing French resistance movements with a crowned king whose authority derived from traditional religious sources rather than military conquest or diplomatic agreement. The coronation also created diplomatic opportunities for French representatives seeking to negotiate alliances with European powers that had previously recognised English claims to French territories. The immediate aftermath of the coronation revealed both the achievements and limitations of Joan's mission, as French forces found themselves facing increasingly organised English and Burgundian resistance, designed to prevent further French territorial gains. Bedford's response to French successes included comprehensive efforts to strengthen English defensive positions, while organising counter-offensives designed to recapture territories lost during the Loire campaign and the March to Reims. These English preparations demonstrated that while Joan's successes had fundamentally altered the strategic balance, they had not eliminated English military capabilities or territorial control in northern France. Joan's capture at Compiègne on May 23, 1430, during a sortie against Burgundian forces besieging the town, eliminated the symbolic and practical leadership that had enabled French military successes during the previous year. The circumstances of her capture reflected the tactical risks inherent in her aggressive leadership style, as she had positioned herself at the forefront of French forces during a complex operation that required careful coordination between garrison troops and external relief forces. Her fall from her horse during the retreat from an unsuccessful attack left her isolated among enemy forces, who immediately recognised the enormous value of their prisoner. The Burgundian decision to sell Joan to English authorities reflected both financial considerations and strategic calculations about the propaganda value of eliminating the symbolic leader of French resistance. The price negotiated for Joan's transfer, 10,000 gold crowns, represented an enormous sum that demonstrated English recognition of her importance to French morale and military effectiveness. The transaction also reflected Burgundian priorities that emphasised immediate financial gain over potential long-term advantages that might result from Joan's continued imprisonment under Burgundian control. The English decision to prosecute Joan for heresy, rather than treating her as a prisoner of war, reflected sophisticated understanding of the religious and political dimensions of her impact on French resistance. English authorities recognised that Joan's influence derived primarily from popular belief in her divine mission rather than conventional military leadership, making it essential to discredit her religious claims in order to undermine French morale and popular support for resistance activities. The heresy charges also provided legal justification for executing Joan despite her status as a captured military leader, as medieval law permitted the execution of heretics regardless of their political or military roles. The trial proceedings at Rouen during 1431 represented a carefully orchestrated judicial process designed to achieve predetermined political objectives while maintaining the appearance of legitimate ecclesiastical procedure. The court, dominated by English supporters and Burgundian collaborators, conducted extensive interrogations that focused on Joan's claims of divine visions, her adoption of male clothing, and her assertion of authority over military and political matters traditionally reserved for male leaders. The theological arguments presented during the trial reflected contemporary debates about the nature of divine revelation and the proper roles of women in religious and secular affairs. Joan's execution on May 30th, 1431, in the marketplace at Rouen, achieved immediate English objectives of eliminating a powerful symbol of French resistance while demonstrating English authority over occupied territories. However, the long-term consequences of her martyrdom proved counterproductive to English interests, as her death transformed her from a controversial military leader into a religious symbol whose influence continued to inspire French resistance long after her physical elimination. The manner of her execution, burned alive as a relapsed heretic, provided French propaganda with powerful imagery that enhanced rather than diminished her symbolic impact on popular resistance to English occupation. The Congress of Arras in 1435 represented the most significant diplomatic development since the Treaty of Troyes, as it provided opportunities for fundamental realignment of the alliances that had determined the course of Anglo-French conflict for the previous 15 years. The negotiations, sponsored by Pope Eugenius IV and the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, brought together representatives from England, France and Burgundy to address the territorial and political disputes that had prevented peaceful resolution of the conflict. The Congress's proceedings revealed the extent to which military developments since Joan's intervention had altered the strategic calculations of all parties involved in the conflict. The English negotiating position at Arras reflected the defensive mentality that had replaced the aggressive expansionism of Henry V's reign, as English representatives focused primarily on securing recognition of existing territorial control, rather than pursuing additional conquests. The English delegation, led by Cardinal Beaufort and the Earl of Huntingdon, possessed limited flexibility due to domestic political constraints that prevented significant territorial concessions without parliamentary approval. The English proposals emphasised maintaining control over Normandy and Calais, while offering to renounce claims to the French throne in exchange for secure recognition of English sovereignty over these territories. French diplomatic objectives at Arras centred on securing Burgundian withdrawal from the English alliance, while minimising territorial concessions that would compromise French long-term strategic interests. Charles VII's representatives, including the Duke of Orleans and various ecclesiastical and legal authorities, possessed greater negotiating flexibility than their English counterparts due to the transformation in French military capabilities that had occurred since Joan's intervention. French proposals offered limited territorial concessions in exchange for Burgundian recognition of Charles's royal authority and termination of Burgundian military support for English forces. The Burgundian position at Arras reflected Philip the Good's recognition that continued alliance with England no longer served Burgundian strategic interests as effectively as accommodation with an increasingly powerful French monarchy. Burgundian territorial objectives focused on securing recognition of their control over territories acquired during the period of English alliance, while obtaining guarantees of autonomy that would protect Burgundian interests from future French interference. Philip's willingness to negotiate seriously with French representatives represented a fundamental shift in Burgundian policy that reflected changing assessments of English and French military capabilities. The breakdown of Anglo-Burgundian negotiations at Arras resulted from English unwillingness to accept the territorial concessions that Philip demanded in exchange for continued alliance, particularly regarding disputed territories in the Somme Valley that both sides considered essential for their strategic security. English representatives recognised that accepting Burgundian demands would establish precedents for territorial concessions that could undermine English control throughout occupied France. However, the refusal to compromise eliminated the possibility of maintaining Burgundian support at the precise moment when French military capabilities were reaching levels that threatened English territorial control. The Treaty of Arras, concluded between France and Burgundy on September 21, 1435, fundamentally altered the strategic balance in favour of French interests by eliminating the alliance that had enabled English territorial control since the Treaty of Troyes. The agreement provided Philip the Good with substantial territorial concessions, including recognition of Burgundian sovereignty over cities along the Somme River and exemption from homage to the French crown during Philip's lifetime. In exchange, Philip acknowledged Charles VII as the legitimate King of France, while agreeing to terminate all military support for English forces and to actively oppose English territorial claims. The immediate military consequences of Burgundian withdrawal from the English alliance became apparent through the systematic French reconquest of territories that had been under English control since Henry V's conquests. French forces, no longer required to defend against Burgundian attacks, could concentrate their efforts against English positions while benefiting from Burgundian neutrality or active support in strategic regions. The loss of Burgundian military assistance forced English commanders to redistribute their limited forces among defensive positions that had previously been secure due to Burgundian protection. Charles VII's military reforms, implemented systematically during the 1440s, transformed French military capabilities through the creation of permanent professional forces that could maintain sustained pressure against English territorial control. The Compagnie d'Ordnance, established in 1445, consisted of cavalry units numbering approximately 12,000 men, organised into companies of 100 lances each, with each lance including a man-at-arms, 2 archers, and various support personnel. These units received regular pay from royal revenues, enabling them to maintain constant readiness for military operations without the delays associated with feudal mobilisation procedures. The professionalisation of French military forces extended beyond cavalry to encompass artillery units equipped with the most advanced siege weapons available in 15th century Europe. French cannon, manufactured in royal foundries established specifically for military production, possessed superior range and destructive capability compared to the older weapons that equipped English fortifications. The systematic deployment of these artillery units enabled French forces to reduce English strongholds through sustained bombardment rather than prolonged blockade, significantly reducing the time required for siege operations while minimising French casualties. French tactical innovations incorporated lessons learned from English military methods while adapting them to French strategic requirements and capabilities. French commanders adopted English practices of using dismounted men-at-arms supported by missile troops, but they emphasised offensive operations rather than the defensive tactics that had characterised English successes. The combination of professional cavalry, improved artillery, and tactical flexibility enabled French forces to conduct complex operations that systematically eliminated English territorial control throughout northern France during the final phase of the conflict. The systematic erosion of English territorial control following the Treaty of Arras accelerated dramatically as French forces exploited the strategic advantages gained through Burgundian neutrality and their own military modernisation. The loss of Paris on April 13, 1436, represented far more than the capture of a single city. It constituted the collapse of English administrative authority over the heartland of northern France and demonstrated the fundamental weakness of English defensive strategies when confronted by coordinated French pressure. The English garrison under Lord Willoughby had numbered fewer than 800 men attempting to control a hostile urban population of approximately 100,000 inhabitants, creating an impossible security situation that French agents had systematically exploited through months of careful preparation. The French recapture of Paris revealed sophisticated intelligence networks that had operated throughout the period of English occupation, providing detailed information about English defensive preparations, garrison strength, and supply arrangements. French forces under Arthur de Richemont coordinated their assault with simultaneous uprisings by Parisian citizens who had maintained clandestine communication with Charles VII's supporters despite years of English surveillance efforts. The coordinated nature of these operations demonstrated the extent to which English administrative control had been undermined by popular resistance that English authorities had consistently underestimated. English defensive positions throughout the Ile-de-France collapsed with remarkable speed once Paris fell, as isolated garrisons found themselves surrounded by hostile populations while facing systematic attacks by French regular forces. The fortress of Vincennes, considered one of the strongest English positions in the region, surrendered after a brief siege when its garrison recognised the futility of prolonged resistance without prospects for relief. Similar capitulations occurred throughout the region as English commanders calculated that honourable surrender offered better prospects for personal survival than doomed defensive efforts that would merely postpone inevitable defeat. The psychological impact of losing Paris extended throughout English-controlled territories, creating a cascade effect that undermined English morale while encouraging French resistance activities in regions that had previously remained quiescent under English administration. English soldiers who'd served in France for years began questioning the sustainability of their positions, while French populations that had accommodated English rule out of necessity rather than preference increasingly demonstrated active hostility toward English officials and garrison forces. The transformation in popular attitudes created security challenges that forced English commanders to concentrate their limited forces in major strongholds rather than maintaining the distributed defensive networks that had previously enabled territorial control. Bedford's death on September 14, 1435, eliminated the most capable English military leader in France at the precise moment when English strategic position was deteriorating most rapidly. His replacement by Richard, Duke of York, represented a significant reduction in English command capabilities, as York lacked Bedford's extensive experience with French conditions and his established relationships with English commanders throughout occupied territories. The change in leadership also reflected English domestic political considerations that prioritised aristocratic privilege over military competence, demonstrating the extent to which English strategic decision-making had become compromised by factional interests that placed personal advancement above effective prosecution of French campaigns. The financial crisis that accompanied English military reversals created additional constraints on English defensive capabilities as royal revenues proved inadequate to maintain the garrison forces necessary for holding extensive territories against determined French pressure. The annual cost of English forces in France had increased substantially as military requirements shifted from offensive operations supported by plunder and ransom to defensive efforts that generated no offsetting revenues while requiring constant expenditure for fortification maintenance, supply procurement, and soldier compensation, parliamentary reluctance to approve additional taxation for French operations reflected growing English recognition that continued continental involvement represented an increasingly poor investment of national resources. The systematic French reconquest of Normandy between 1449 and 1450 demonstrated the effectiveness of Charles VII's military reforms, while revealing the fundamental weaknesses of English defensive strategies that had been designed for different strategic circumstances. French forces under Jean de Dunois implemented coordinated campaigns that combined siege operations against major English strongholds with cavalry raids that disrupted English supply lines and prevented effective coordination between isolated garrisons. The speed of French operations prevented English commanders from implementing mutual support arrangements that might have enabled prolonged resistance despite French numerical superiority. The capture of Rouen on October 29, 1449, marked a particularly significant moment in the French reconquest, as the city had served as the administrative centre for English rule in Normandy since Henry V's conquest 30 years earlier. The English garrison under Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, had attempted to organise comprehensive defensive preparations that would enable prolonged resistance against French siege operations. However, the city's population actively supported French forces through intelligence gathering, sabotage of English defensive works, and direct assistance during the final assault phases that overwhelmed English resistance. French artillery played a decisive role in reducing English fortifications throughout Normandy, as improved cannon design and manufacturing techniques had created weapons capable of breaching even the strongest medieval defensive works within relatively short periods. The systematic deployment of these artillery units enabled French forces to conduct multiple simultaneous siege operations, rather than concentrating their entire army against individual English positions, creating pressure across the entire English defensive network that prevented effective mutual support between garrisons. English fortifications, constructed primarily during the early 15th century, had not incorporated design modifications necessary to withstand sustained bombardment by improved artillery, making them increasingly vulnerable to French siege techniques. The Battle of Formigny on April 15, 1450, represented the decisive engagement that eliminated organised English resistance in Normandy, while demonstrating the tactical innovations that had transformed French military capabilities since Joan of Arc's intervention. The English force under Thomas Kyriel numbered approximately 4,000 men, including experienced soldiers who had served in previous French campaigns alongside recent reinforcements from England. The English army had landed at Cherbourg in March 1450, with instructions to relieve English garrisons throughout Normandy, while re-establishing English territorial control in regions that had been lost to French advances. English tactical deployment at Formigny initially followed established patterns that had proved successful in previous engagements, with dismounted men-at-arms positioned behind protective stakes, while longbowmen were deployed on the flanks to provide concentrated missile fire against attacking French forces. The English position occupied elevated ground that provided excellent fields of fire, while forcing French forces to advance uphill against concentrated archery, creating conditions that theoretically favoured English defensive capabilities. However, French tactical innovations had specifically addressed the challenges posed by English defensive systems, developing countermeasures that neutralised traditional English advantages. French artillery deployment at Formigny marked the first systematic use of cannon against English field positions, creating tactical conditions that English commanders had not previously encountered in major engagements. The French guns, positioned beyond the effective range of English longbows, delivered sustained bombardment that inflicted casualties on English forces while remaining immune to English countermeasures. The psychological impact of artillery fire proved as significant as its physical effects, as English soldiers found themselves under attack from weapons against which their traditional defensive methods provided no protection. The arrival of French reinforcements under Arthur de Richemont during the battle's later phases provided French forces with overwhelming numerical superiority that enabled coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The French cavalry units that had been held in reserve struck English flanks, while the main French force maintained pressure against English front positions, creating tactical conditions that prevented English forces from maintaining their defensive formation. The systematic nature of French tactical coordination demonstrated the professional military capabilities that had been developed through Charles VII's military reforms. English casualties at Formigny exceeded 3,000 men, representing the virtual elimination of the last significant English field army in Normandy, and ending any prospect of English territorial recovery in the region. Thomas Kyriel's capture eliminated experienced English command leadership, while the deaths of numerous other English officers significantly weakened English military capabilities throughout remaining English-controlled territories. The battle's outcome demonstrated that English tactical methods, which had dominated European warfare for over a century, had become obsolete when confronted by French forces equipped with modern artillery and organised according to professional military principles. The final English strongholds in Normandy capitulated with remarkable speed following the disaster at Formigny, as garrison commanders recognised that continued resistance would merely postpone inevitable defeat while exposing their forces to unnecessary casualties. Caen surrendered on July 1st, 1450, followed by Cherbourg on August 12th, effectively eliminating English territorial presence in Normandy after 33 years of occupation. The speed of these capitulations reflected not only military realities but also the transformation in popular attitudes that had made English rule increasingly untenable even in regions where English garrisons remained capable of prolonged resistance. The English domestic political crisis that erupted during the 1450s fundamentally compromised English ability to respond effectively to French military successes while creating conditions that would eventually evolve into the Wars of the Roses. Henry VI's periodic episodes of mental incapacity, beginning with his complete breakdown in 1453, eliminated effective royal leadership at the precise moment when English strategic position required decisive action to prevent total loss of continental territories. The king's condition created a regency crisis that paralysed English governmental functions while enabling competing aristocratic factions to pursue their own interests, rather than coordinating effective responses to French military pressure. The rivalry between Richard, Duke of York, and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, reflected deeper tensions within English aristocratic society regarding responsibility for military failures in France and appropriate strategies for addressing continuing territorial losses. York supporters blamed Somerset's military incompetence for English defeats, while arguing that continued French involvement represented wasteful expenditure of resources that could be better employed for English domestic development. Somerset's faction maintained that English territorial losses resulted from inadequate financial support rather than military failure, arguing that increased parliamentary funding could enable recovery of lost territories through renewed military campaigns. The popular uprising led by Jack Cade during the summer of 1450 demonstrated the extent to which English domestic stability had been undermined by military failures in France and the perceived incompetence of royal administration. The rebellion, which briefly controlled London before being suppressed through military action, reflected widespread English resentment regarding taxation imposed to finance unsuccessful French campaigns, while domestic grievances remained unaddressed. Cade's execution of several royal officials, including James Fiennes, Lord Say and Selle, symbolically represented popular rejection of the administrative systems that had managed English involvement in France. The systematic French reconquest of Aquitaine during 1451 eliminated English control over territories that had been under English rule for 3 centuries, demonstrating that even the most established English territorial presence could not survive determined French pressure supported by modern military capabilities. The French campaign under Jean de Dunois employed the same combination of artillery bombardment and coordinated assault that had proved effective in Normandy, systematically reducing English strongholds while preventing effective mutual support between isolated garrisons. The speed of French operations reflected both improved French military efficiency and the fundamental weakness of English defensive positions that had been designed for different strategic circumstances. Bordeaux's surrender on June 30th, 1451, represented the symbolic end of English territorial empire in southwestern France, as the city had served as the administrative and commercial centre for English rule in Aquitaine since the 12th century. The English garrison under John Talbot had attempted to organise comprehensive defensive preparations that would enable prolonged resistance against French siege operations, but the city's population increasingly supported French forces through intelligence gathering and direct assistance that undermined English defensive efforts. The transformation in popular attitudes reflected not only military considerations but also economic calculations, as Gascon merchants recognised that accommodation with French rule offered better prospects for commercial prosperity than continued resistance that would invite French retaliation. The brief English recovery of Bordeaux in October 1452 demonstrated both the persistence of English strategic ambitions and the fundamental weakness of English military capabilities when confronted by modern French forces. John Talbot's expedition, numbering approximately 3,000 men, succeeded in recapturing the city through surprise attack that exploited temporary weakness in French defensive preparations. However, the English force lacked the strength necessary to maintain territorial control against inevitable French counterattacks while facing hostile populations that had already accommodated French rule and viewed English return as temporary disruption rather than legitimate restoration. The Battle of Castillon on July 17, 1453, represented the final major engagement of the Hundred Years' War and demonstrated the decisive superiority of French military organisation over traditional English tactical methods. The French defensive position, established by Jean Bureau and his artillery specialists, incorporated the most advanced fortification techniques available in 15th century Europe, creating defensive works that could withstand English assault while providing platforms for concentrated artillery fire against attacking forces. The French army numbered approximately 7,000 men organised into professional units that possessed superior equipment and training compared to English forces that relied increasingly on hastily recruited reinforcements. English tactical deployment at Castillon followed traditional patterns that had proved successful in previous centuries, with dismounted men-at-arms advancing against French positions, while longbowmen provided supporting fire from protected positions. However, French defensive preparations had specifically addressed these tactical approaches, creating conditions that neutralised English advantages while maximising French capabilities. The systematic deployment of French artillery created killing zones that prevented English forces from approaching French positions, while French cavalry units positioned for counterattack could exploit any weakness in English formation that developed during prolonged assault operations. John Talbot's death during the battle eliminated the most experienced English field commander remaining in French service, while symbolically representing the end of English military effectiveness in continental warfare. Talbot, who had served in France for over 30 years and participated in most major English campaigns since Henry V's conquests, represented the continuity between English military success during the early 15th century and the systematic failures that characterised English operations during the 1440s and 1450s. His death at age 66, leading a hopeless assault against prepared French positions, epitomised the obsolescence of English tactical methods when confronted by modern French military capabilities. The systematic elimination of English territorial control in France during the 1450s coincided with a fundamental transformation in military technology and organisation that would reshape European warfare for centuries to come. The crude bombards that had appeared sporadically during the 14th century evolved into sophisticated artillery systems capable of reducing the strongest medieval fortifications within days rather than months. French foundries, established under Charles VII's comprehensive military reforms, produced bronze cannon with standardized calibers and improved metallurgy that delivered unprecedented destructive power. These weapons, ranging from massive siege guns weighing several tons to lighter field pieces that could accompany advancing armies, required entirely new approaches to both offensive and defensive warfare. The technical specifications of these early cannon reveal the rapid pace of military innovation during the mid-15th century. The largest French siege guns, such as those employed at the reduction of English strongholds in Normandy, possessed bore diameters exceeding 12 inches and could fire stone projectiles weighing over 400 pounds at ranges approaching 1,500 yards. The manufacturing process required specialized knowledge of bronze casting techniques, gunpowder chemistry and ballistic calculations that represented significant advances over traditional medieval craftsmanship. French artillery units included not only the gunners who operated these weapons, but also teams of specialists responsible for powder preparation, projectile manufacture, and the complex logistics required to transport and position such massive equipment. The impact of improved artillery on siege warfare extended far beyond mere destructive capability to encompass fundamental changes in the relationship between offensive and defensive military operations. Medieval fortifications, designed to withstand attacks by traditional siege engines, proved catastrophically vulnerable to sustained cannon bombardment that could breach walls within hours of concentrated fire. The psychological effect on defending garrisons often proved as decisive as the physical damage, as soldiers accustomed to the gradual attrition of traditional siege warfare found themselves facing immediate destruction from weapons against which their defensive preparations provided no protection. English commanders, whose experience derived primarily from earlier conflicts where artillery played minimal roles, proved particularly unprepared for the systematic application of concentrated firepower that characterized French siege operations during the 1440s and 1450s. The transformation of battlefield tactics reflected equally significant changes in military organization and professional training that distinguished 15th century armies from their medieval predecessors. The French Compagnies d'Ordonnance represented a revolutionary departure from traditional feudal military service, creating permanent professional units that maintained constant readiness for military operations while developing specialized skills through continuous training and campaign experience. Each company consisted of 100 lances, with individual lances comprising a man-at-arms equipped with complete plate armor and multiple weapons, 2 mounted archers carrying both longbows and crossbows, and several support personnel including pages, grooms, and specialists responsible for equipment maintenance. The standardization of equipment within these professional units enabled tactical coordination that had been impossible with traditional feudal levies, whose members possessed widely varying levels of training, equipment quality, and military experience. French men-at-arms carried identical weapons manufactured in royal armories according to specifications developed through systematic analysis of combat effectiveness, while their horses were selected and trained according to standardized criteria that emphasized speed, endurance, and battlefield reliability. The mounted archers who supported each lance possessed specialized training in both mounted and dismounted combat techniques, enabling them to adapt their tactical role according to specific battlefield conditions rather than being limited to single combat functions. The decline of heavy cavalry as the dominant force in European warfare reflected both technological changes and evolving tactical doctrine that emphasized flexibility and coordination over individual martial prowess. The plate armor that had provided near invulnerability against traditional medieval weapons proved increasingly ineffective against improved crossbows, early firearms, and specialized anti-armor weapons developed specifically to counter heavily armored opponents. French tactical innovations emphasized the coordinated employment of different military arms, rather than relying on cavalry charges that had dominated medieval battlefields, creating combined arms systems that integrated infantry, cavalry, and artillery in mutually supporting roles. Professional infantry units, organised according to principles derived from classical military treatises and contemporary battlefield experience, replaced the poorly trained peasant levies that had characterised medieval armies. These soldiers received regular pay that enabled them to focus exclusively on military training, rather than dividing their attention between military service and civilian occupations. Their equipment included not only traditional weapons such as pikes, halberds, and crossbows, but also early firearms, whose effectiveness continued to improve through technological refinement and tactical innovation. The systematic training provided to these professional soldiers emphasized discipline, unit cohesion, and tactical flexibility that enabled complex maneuvers under battlefield conditions. The development of specialized military engineering capabilities represented another crucial aspect of the military revolution that transformed 15th century warfare. Professional engineers trained in mathematics, metallurgy, and construction techniques designed fortifications that incorporated lessons learned from artillery attacks while developing siege techniques that maximized the effectiveness of improved weapons. These specialists possessed knowledge of ballistic principles that enabled accurate calculation of projectile trajectories, optimal positioning of artillery pieces, and systematic approaches to breaching enemy fortifications through concentrated bombardment of structurally vulnerable points. Fortification design evolved rapidly in response to artillery threats, incorporating features such as lower, thicker walls that could better absorb cannon fire, angled bastions that eliminated blind spots in defensive coverage, and complex entrance systems that prevented direct artillery attacks on gates and other vulnerable points. The construction of these improved fortifications required substantial financial investment and technical expertise that only the most powerful monarchies could afford, creating strategic advantages for kingdoms that possessed the resources necessary to implement comprehensive defensive modernization programs. English fortifications in France, constructed primarily during the early 15th century according to pre-artillery design principles, proved systematically vulnerable to French artillery attacks that exploited structural weaknesses in their defensive systems. The economic implications of maintaining professional armies created fundamental changes in royal finance and administrative organisation that extended far beyond immediate military considerations. The annual cost of maintaining the French Compagnies d'Ordonnance exceeded 400,000 livres, representing approximately 1/3 of total royal revenues under normal circumstances. This enormous expenditure required systematic tax collection, efficient administrative procedures, and economic policies designed to generate sufficient revenues for sustained military operations without destroying the productive capacity that provided the foundation for royal income. The development of military supply systems capable of supporting professional armies during extended campaigns required logistical capabilities that surpassed anything achieved during medieval warfare. Professional armies consumed standardized equipment, ammunition, and provisions in quantities that necessitated systematic procurement, transportation, and distribution networks extending across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory. French military administration established permanent supply depots, standardized equipment specifications, and contractual relationships with manufacturers that enabled sustained operations without the delays and inefficiencies that had characterized earlier military campaigns, dependent on improvised logistics. The shift from feudal military service to professional armies fundamentally altered the relationship between monarchy and nobility throughout Europe, as traditional military obligations based on land tenure were replaced by monetary taxation that funded hired soldiers. Nobles who had previously provided military service in exchange for land grants found themselves paying taxes to support royal armies, while losing their traditional role as the primary military force within their kingdoms. This transformation strengthened royal authority while reducing noble independence, creating political tensions that would influence European development for centuries to come. The social consequences of military professionalization extended throughout European society as warfare became increasingly separated from civilian life rather than involving entire populations in military activities. Professional soldiers developed distinct identities and interests that sometimes conflicted with civilian priorities, while their specialized skills and equipment requirements created new forms of social stratification based on military function rather than traditional feudal relationships. The emergence of veteran communities, military families, and specialized military towns reflected the growing separation between military and civilian society that characterized the transition from medieval to early modern warfare. The technological innovations that transformed artillery effectiveness during the 15th century reflected broader changes in European manufacturing capabilities and scientific knowledge that extended far beyond military applications. The metallurgical techniques required for producing effective cannon contributed to advances in other industries, while the mathematical knowledge necessary for ballistic calculations influenced developments in navigation, architecture, and mechanical engineering. The systematic approach to problem-solving that characterized military engineering provided models for addressing civilian challenges ranging from urban planning to agricultural improvement. The standardization of gunpowder composition and manufacturing procedures represented crucial advances in chemical knowledge and industrial organization that enabled reliable artillery performance under battlefield conditions. Early gunpowder mixtures had varied significantly in quality and effectiveness due to inconsistent ingredients and manufacturing procedures, creating unreliable weapons that posed dangers to their operators as well as intended targets. French military administration established standardized formulas, quality control procedures, and manufacturing facilities that produced consistent gunpowder capable of delivering predictable ballistic performance across different weapons and battlefield conditions. The training requirements for effective artillery operation created new categories of military specialists whose knowledge combined practical experience with theoretical understanding of ballistic principles, metallurgy, and chemical processes. Master gunners possessed skills that extended far beyond simple weapon operation to encompass maintenance procedures, ammunition preparation, and tactical employment that maximized artillery effectiveness while minimizing risks to friendly forces. These specialists commanded substantial salaries and social status that reflected their crucial importance to military operations, while their knowledge was carefully guarded as state secrets that provided strategic advantages over potential enemies. The impact of military innovation on English strategic capabilities proved particularly devastating because English military organisation had remained largely unchanged since the early 15th century victories that had established English territorial control in France. English commanders continued to rely on tactical methods and organisational systems that had proved effective against medieval French armies, but were systematically outclassed by French forces equipped with modern weapons and organised according to professional military principles. The conservative nature of English military culture, which emphasised traditional methods that had achieved previous successes, prevented adaptation to changing technological and tactical conditions that would have been necessary for maintaining military effectiveness. The financial constraints that limited English military modernisation reflected broader economic problems that had developed during the prolonged continental campaigns of the early 15th century. The enormous costs of maintaining English garrisons throughout occupied France had exhausted royal revenues while providing diminishing returns as French resistance reduced the territorial control that justified continued military expenditure. Parliamentary reluctance to approve additional taxation for French operations reflected growing recognition that continued continental involvement represented poor investment of English resources that could be better employed for domestic development and defence against Scottish threats that posed more immediate dangers to English security. The collapse of English territorial control in France during the 1450s thus represented not merely military defeat, but fundamental failure to adapt to changing conditions that had transformed European warfare during the preceding decades. The systematic nature of English losses, occurring across multiple theatres simultaneously, demonstrated that French military superiority reflected comprehensive advantages in organisation, equipment, and tactical doctrine rather than temporary setbacks that could be overcome through traditional responses. The speed with which English positions collapsed once French pressure intensified revealed the extent to which English defensive strategies had become obsolete when confronted by modern military capabilities that English forces could neither match nor effectively counter through alternative tactical approaches. The demographic catastrophe that accompanied the 100 Years' War fundamentally transformed the social fabric of both England and France, creating population disruptions that extended far beyond immediate battlefield casualties to encompass systematic displacement, urban decline, and the collapse of agricultural systems that had sustained medieval society for centuries. The scale of population movement during the conflict dwarfed anything previously experienced in European history, as entire communities abandoned their ancestral lands to escape advancing armies, while others found themselves forcibly relocated by military commanders seeking to deny resources to enemy forces or establish loyal populations in conquered territories. The systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure during military campaigns created cascading effects that persisted long after armies had moved on to other theatres of operation. The chevauchée tactics employed by English forces during the 14th century deliberately targeted rural production systems, destroying crops, slaughtering livestock, and burning farm buildings with the specific intention of undermining French economic capacity while generating terror among civilian populations. French records from the Île-de-France region indicate that over 60% of rural settlements suffered significant damage during English raids between 1346 and 1360, with many villages remaining abandoned for decades after the initial destruction. The reconstruction of these agricultural systems required substantial investment in livestock, seed grain, and farm equipment that depleted resources throughout the affected regions while reducing overall productive capacity. The wine-producing regions of southwestern France experienced particularly severe disruption as competing armies recognised the strategic importance of controlling territories that generated substantial commercial revenues. The vineyards around Bordeaux, which had provided the foundation for Anglo-Gascon trade relationships since the 12th century, suffered systematic destruction during French reconquest campaigns that deliberately targeted the economic basis of English territorial control. Contemporary accounts describe French forces cutting down mature vines that had required decades to establish, destroying wine presses and storage facilities, and eliminating the specialised knowledge possessed by vintners, whose families had developed particular cultivation techniques over generations. The recovery of wine production in these regions required not only physical reconstruction, but also the painstaking process of replanting vineyards and re-establishing the commercial networks that connected producers with distant markets. Urban centres throughout both kingdoms experienced demographic collapse that reflected both direct military action and the broader economic disruption caused by prolonged warfare. Cities that served as administrative centres for English occupation forces, such as Rouen and Caen in Normandy, underwent systematic population replacement as French inhabitants fled or were expelled to make room for English colonists whose loyalty could be trusted by occupation authorities. The demographic data available from tax records indicates that Rouen population declined by approximately 40% between 1417 and 1435, while many smaller Norman towns lost even higher proportions of their inhabitants through death, flight, or forced relocation. The destruction of commercial infrastructure created particularly severe challenges for urban recovery, as the specialized crafts and trading relationships that sustained medieval cities required generations to re-establish once they had been disrupted by military action. The cloth-producing centres of Flanders experienced repeated disruption as English and French forces competed for control over the wool trade that connected English producers with Flemish manufacturers. The siege operations that characterised urban warfare during the conflict systematically destroyed the workshops, warehouses and transportation facilities that enabled commercial production, while the departure of skilled craftsmen eliminated the technical knowledge necessary for maintaining specialised manufacturing processes. The financial costs of sustaining military operations over more than a century created unprecedented demands on royal revenues that necessitated fundamental innovations in taxation systems and governmental administration. English expenditure on French campaigns between 1337 and 1453 exceeded £5 million, representing approximately 10 times the normal annual royal income and requiring systematic exploitation of every available revenue source. The development of new taxation methods, including parliamentary subsidies, customs duties and forced loans, created administrative systems that fundamentally altered the relationship between monarchy and subjects while establishing precedents for royal financial authority that would influence governmental development for centuries. The English wool subsidy, first imposed in 1340 to finance Edward III's continental campaigns, demonstrates the systematic nature of fiscal innovation required to sustain prolonged warfare. This tax, levied on wool exports at rates that sometimes exceeded the commodity's market value, generated substantial revenues while fundamentally altering the structure of English commercial relationships with continental markets. The subsidies collection required detailed record-keeping, specialised administrative personnel, and enforcement mechanisms that created one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated revenue systems. However, the tax's burden fell disproportionately on wool producers and merchants, whose economic activities provided the foundation for English prosperity, creating long-term economic distortions that reduced overall productive capacity while generating immediate military revenues. French fiscal innovations proved even more extensive than English developments, as the kingdom's larger population and more complex territorial structure required more sophisticated administrative systems to extract the resources necessary for military operations. The establishment of permanent taxation under Charles VII represented a revolutionary departure from traditional feudal finance, creating royal revenues that continued during peacetime rather than being limited to specific military campaigns. The taille, initially imposed as a temporary war tax, became a permanent royal prerogative that generated approximately 1.2 million livres annually by the 1450s, providing the foundation for maintaining professional military forces while funding the governmental expansion necessary for effective territorial administration. The development of royal debt instruments created new forms of financial obligation that extended governmental authority while creating complex relationships between monarchy and the merchant communities that provided credit for military operations. English royal borrowing from Italian banking houses, particularly the Bardi and Peruzzi companies during the early phases of the conflict, established precedents for international finance that connected military operations with commercial networks spanning multiple kingdoms. The systematic default on these obligations during the 1340s, caused by English inability to service debt levels that had grown beyond sustainable limits, created financial crises that extended throughout European commercial systems while demonstrating the risks associated with financing prolonged military campaigns. The emergence of specialised fiscal institutions reflected the administrative complexity required to manage the unprecedented financial demands created by sustained warfare. the English Exchequer developed sophisticated accounting procedures that tracked military expenditures across multiple theatres of operation, while maintaining detailed records of revenue collection from diverse sources ranging from parliamentary subsidies to feudal obligations. French fiscal administration underwent even more extensive development, creating regional treasuries that coordinated tax collection across territories with different legal traditions and economic structures while maintaining central oversight of military expenditure that ensured resources reached the armies that required them. The social mobility generated by military service created opportunities for advancement that fundamentally altered traditional hierarchical structures, while establishing new forms of aristocratic authority based on military achievement rather than hereditary privilege. English commanders who distinguished themselves during continental campaigns received substantial rewards, including land grants, noble titles, and administrative positions that elevated them far above their original social status. John Chandos, whose origins lay in minor Derbyshire gentry, received extensive territories in Poitou following his service during the Black Prince's campaigns, while his military reputation enabled him to negotiate marriage alliances with established noble families that had previously been beyond his social reach. The systematic creation of new noble families through military service reflected both the practical requirements of administering conquered territories and the ideological changes that accompanied the transformation of warfare from feudal obligation to professional service. English administration in occupied France required reliable officials who possessed both military competence and administrative skills, creating opportunities for advancement that attracted ambitious individuals from throughout English society. The careers of commanders such as Robert Knowles, who rose from obscure origins to command major military operations and accumulate substantial wealth through successful campaigns, demonstrated the extent to which military service could provide pathways to social advancement that had been virtually impossible under traditional feudal systems. The decline of traditional feudal structures accelerated as monarchies developed alternative sources of military service that reduced their dependence on noble levies while providing more reliable and effective armed forces. The French Compagnies d'Ordonnance represented a systematic replacement of feudal military obligations with professional service that fundamentally altered the relationship between monarchy and nobility. Nobles who had previously provided military service in exchange for land tenure found themselves paying taxes to support royal armies while losing their traditional role as the kingdom's primary military force. This transformation strengthened royal authority while reducing noble independence, creating political tensions that contributed to aristocratic resistance movements throughout both kingdoms. The evolution of knightly ideals reflected the practical changes in military organisation, while attempting to maintain traditional concepts of noble honour and martial virtue. The development of chivalric orders such as the English Order of the Garter and the French Order of the Star provided institutional frameworks for recognising military achievement, while adapting traditional knightly values to the realities of professional warfare. These orders emphasised loyalty to royal authority, coordination with fellow knights, and adherence to codes of conduct that balanced individual honour with collective military effectiveness. The elaborate ceremonies and symbolic practices associated with these institutions served to maintain noble identity and cohesion, despite the fundamental changes in military organisation that had reduced the practical importance of individual knightly prowess. The transformation of military technology and tactics created new categories of military specialists whose skills and social status challenged traditional hierarchies based on noble birth and feudal obligation. Master gunners, military engineers and professional soldiers possessed technical knowledge and practical capabilities that proved essential for military success while commanding substantial salaries and social recognition. These specialists often achieved higher incomes and greater social mobility than traditional knights whose martial skills had become less relevant to contemporary warfare. creating tensions within military hierarchies that reflected broader social changes accompanying the transition from feudal to professional military organisation. The cultural and linguistic consequences of prolonged Anglo-French conflict fundamentally altered the development of national identities in both kingdoms, while reducing the cosmopolitan character that had previously characterised European aristocratic culture. The systematic use of vernacular languages in governmental administration, military organisation, and diplomatic correspondence reflected both practical necessity and deliberate policy designed to strengthen popular identification with royal authority. English administrative documents in occupied France increasingly employed English terminology and legal concepts that distinguished English rule from French traditions, while French resistance propaganda emphasised linguistic and cultural differences that justified opposition to foreign occupation. The decline of French influence in English court culture represented a dramatic reversal of patterns that had dominated English aristocratic society since the Norman conquest. The French language, which had served as the primary means of communication among English nobility for over 2 centuries, gradually gave way to English as the preferred language for governmental administration, legal proceedings, and literary expression. This linguistic transformation reflected both practical considerations, as prolonged warfare had reduced cultural exchange between English and French aristocratic communities, and deliberate policy decisions designed to strengthen English national identity through cultural distinctiveness. English literary development during the 14th and 15th centuries demonstrated the systematic replacement of French cultural models with indigenous traditions that emphasised English historical experience and linguistic heritage. The works of Geoffrey Chaucer, John Gower, and other contemporary writers employed English vernacular to explore themes that celebrated English achievements while criticising French cultural pretensions and political ambitions. The development of English historical chronicles that emphasised the legitimacy of English territorial claims and the superiority of English military methods provided intellectual justification for continued warfare while strengthening popular support for royal policies. French cultural development followed parallel patterns as intellectuals and artists created works that emphasised French historical traditions while rejecting English cultural influence as foreign contamination of authentic French identity. The systematic development of French vernacular literature, legal terminology and administrative language reflected deliberate efforts to distinguish French culture from English influence while strengthening popular identification with French royal authority. The works of Christine de Pizan and other contemporary writers celebrated French cultural achievements while portraying English occupation as a temporary aberration that would inevitably be overcome through French cultural and military superiority. The strengthening of national identities fundamentally altered diplomatic relationships throughout Europe, as kingdoms increasingly pursued policies based on perceived national interests, rather than the dynastic considerations that had previously dominated international relations. The concept of natural boundaries, which suggested that kingdoms possessed inherent territorial limits based on geographic features and cultural characteristics, provided intellectual justification for territorial claims while legitimizing resistance to foreign occupation. These ideas influenced not only Anglo-French relations, but also the development of political theory throughout Europe as intellectuals attempted to define the proper relationship between political authority and cultural identity. The religious dimensions of national identity development created additional complexities as both kingdoms claimed divine sanction for their territorial ambitions, while portraying their enemies as opponents of legitimate Christian authority. English propaganda consistently portrayed French resistance as rebellion against lawful royal authority established through divine providence and military victory, while French propaganda depicted English occupation as foreign tyranny that violated natural law and Christian principles. These competing religious claims created theological debates that extended throughout European intellectual communities, while influencing popular attitudes toward the conflict's legitimacy and probable outcome. The economic consequences of cultural transformation extended throughout both kingdoms as changing patterns of trade, communication, and cultural exchange reflected the political hostilities that had developed during prolonged warfare. The disruption of traditional commercial relationships between English and French merchants created opportunities for alternative trading partnerships while reducing the economic integration that had previously connected the two kingdoms through complex networks of mutual dependence. The development of English commercial relationships with Flemish, German, and Iberian partners reflected both practical necessity and deliberate policy designed to reduce English economic vulnerability to French political pressure. The systematic transformation of European monarchy during the 100 Years' War established precedents for centralized state power that would fundamentally reshape political organization throughout the continent for centuries to come. The administrative innovations developed by both English and French monarchies to finance and coordinate prolonged military campaigns created governmental structures that possessed unprecedented authority over subjects' lives, while establishing direct relationships between royal authority and individual citizens that bypassed traditional feudal intermediaries. Charles VII's establishment of permanent royal taxation represented the most significant constitutional development, as it provided French monarchs with independent revenue sources that eliminated their dependence on noble consent for military financing. This fiscal independence enabled systematic expansion of royal administrative apparatus, creating bureaucratic systems staffed by educated professionals whose loyalty derived from royal appointment rather than hereditary obligation or feudal ties. The French Compagnie d'Ordonnance similarly established the principle of royal monopoly over legitimate military force, fundamentally altering the balance of power between monarchy and nobility throughout the kingdom. The systematic replacement of feudal military service with professional armies directly controlled by royal authority eliminated the traditional military independence that had enabled noble resistance to royal policies while providing monarchs with reliable military instruments for enforcing governmental decisions. The administrative systems required to maintain these professional forces created extensive bureaucratic networks that extended royal authority into local communities throughout the kingdom, establishing direct governmental presence in regions that had previously remained largely autonomous under feudal arrangements. English constitutional development followed different patterns due to the kingdom's parliamentary traditions and the financial constraints imposed by unsuccessful continental campaigns, but the conflict's requirements similarly strengthened royal administrative capabilities while establishing precedents for expanded governmental authority. The systematic development of parliamentary taxation to finance French campaigns created constitutional mechanisms that balanced royal prerogative with representative consent, establishing principles of fiscal accountability that would influence English governmental development throughout subsequent centuries. The administrative complexity required to collect and manage these revenues created professional bureaucratic systems that possessed detailed knowledge of English economic resources, while maintaining sophisticated record-keeping procedures that enabled systematic exploitation of the available wealth. The decline of feudal fragmentation throughout both kingdoms reflected not only administrative centralization, but also fundamental changes in military technology and organization that reduced the practical importance of traditional feudal relationships. The systematic replacement of feudal levies with professional armies eliminated the military foundations of feudal authority, while creating new forms of dependency based on royal employment rather than hereditary obligation. Noble families that had previously maintained independent military capabilities found themselves increasingly reliant on royal favour for advancement and security, as their traditional sources of power became obsolete in the face of professional military organisation equipped with advanced weapons systems. The emergence of national consciousness represented perhaps the most profound transformation accomplished during the conflict, as populations throughout both kingdoms developed identities based on territorial and cultural affiliations, rather than personal loyalty to feudal superiors. The systematic use of vernacular languages in governmental administration, military organisation, and popular propaganda created shared cultural experiences that transcended traditional social boundaries while establishing common identities that united different social classes around territorial and linguistic characteristics. English national identity, which had previously been limited primarily to aristocratic circles that maintained cultural connections with Norman traditions, expanded to encompass broader populations whose experiences of French invasion and occupation created shared resentment against foreign interference. French national consciousness developed through similar processes as populations throughout the kingdom experienced English occupation and administrative control that distinguished foreign rule from indigenous governmental traditions. The systematic resistance to English cultural influence, combined with popular support for French military recovery under Charles VII and Joan of Arc, created national identity based on opposition to foreign domination rather than positive identification with particular governmental institutions. This defensive nationalism proved remarkably durable and influential, providing ideological foundations for French territorial expansion and cultural imperialism throughout subsequent centuries while establishing precedents for popular resistance to foreign occupation that would inspire liberation movements throughout European history. The military innovations developed during the 100 Years' War fundamentally transformed European warfare, while establishing tactical and technological precedents that would influence military development throughout the early modern period. The systematic integration of artillery into siege operations eliminated the defensive advantages that medieval fortifications had provided for centuries, creating military conditions that favoured offensive operations while reducing the strategic importance of individual strongpoints. The technical knowledge required for effective artillery employment, including ballistic calculations, metallurgical expertise, and logistical coordination, created new categories of military specialists whose professional competence proved essential for military success regardless of traditional social status or noble birth. The development of combined arms tactics that coordinated infantry, cavalry, and artillery units in mutually supporting roles established military principles that would dominate European battlefields throughout the early modern period. The French tactical innovations that proved decisive during the final phases of the conflict demonstrated the superiority of coordinated professional units over traditional feudal levies, while the systematic training and standardized equipment that characterized these forces created military capabilities that could be replicated and improved through systematic study and institutional development. The military academies and professional officer corps that emerged during subsequent centuries traced their origins to the organizational innovations developed during the 100 Years' War. The influence of these military lessons extended throughout European conflicts during the 15th and 16th centuries as competing powers adopted and refined the tactical and technological innovations that had proved decisive in Anglo-French warfare. The Italian wars that dominated European politics during the late 15th and early 16th centuries demonstrated systematic application of artillery-based siege techniques and combined arms tactics that had been developed during the 100 Years' War, while the Habsburg-Valois rivalry reflected the continuation of territorial competition between centralized monarchies that employed professional military forces organized according to principles established during the earlier conflict. The systematic study of military history and tactical theory that characterized Renaissance military thought drew extensively on the experiences and innovations of the 100 Years' War, creating intellectual traditions that analyze the relationship between military technology, tactical organization, and strategic success. Military treatises produced during the 16th century consistently referenced English archery tactics, French artillery innovations, and the administrative systems that had enabled sustained military campaigns across multiple theatres of operation. These analytical approaches to military science established precedents for systematic study of warfare that would influence military education and professional development throughout subsequent centuries. The geopolitical consequences of the Hundred Years' War established territorial and strategic patterns that would influence European international relations for centuries, fundamentally altering the balance of power between maritime and continental orientations, while creating precedents for colonial expansion and commercial competition. England's definitive loss of continental territories, except for the isolated enclave of Calais, eliminated the territorial foundations of English involvement in European continental politics, while creating strategic imperatives for alternative approaches to international influence and economic expansion. The systematic development of English naval capabilities during the later phases of the conflict provided the foundation for maritime expansion that would characterise English strategic policy throughout the early modern period. English naval innovations developed during the conflict included improvements in ship design, navigation techniques, and fleet organisation that enabled extended operations far from home bases while maintaining effective coordination between multiple vessels operating across vast oceanic distances. The administrative systems created to support English naval operations in the Channel and along French coasts provided organisational models for the systematic exploration and commercial exploitation of Atlantic territories that would generate the wealth and strategic advantages enabling English emergence as a global maritime power. The technical knowledge and institutional experience gained through maritime warfare against French forces directly contributed to English success in subsequent colonial ventures throughout the Americas and Asia. The transformation of English commercial relationships during the conflict created economic networks that connected English producers with markets throughout Northern Europe, while reducing dependence on French commercial partnerships that had characterised medieval English trade patterns. The systematic development of English wool exports to Flemish and German markets established commercial relationships that provided alternative sources of revenue, while creating diplomatic partnerships that supported English strategic interests throughout subsequent European conflicts. These commercial networks provided the economic foundations for English colonial expansion while establishing precedents for systematic exploitation of overseas territories that would characterise English imperial development throughout the early modern period. French territorial consolidation following the successful expulsion of English forces created the foundation for systematic expansion of French influence throughout continental Europe, while establishing precedents for cultural and political imperialism that would characterise French strategic policy throughout subsequent centuries. The administrative systems developed to govern territories recovered from English occupation provided organisational models for French expansion into Italian, German, and Spanish territories during the Habsburg-Valois conflicts, while the military capabilities that had proved decisive against English forces enabled French intervention in conflicts throughout the continent. French cultural influence expanded systematically throughout Europe as the kingdom's successful resistance to English occupation demonstrated the superiority of French governmental institutions and cultural traditions over foreign alternatives. The systematic development of French vernacular literature, legal systems, and administrative practices during the conflict created cultural models that influenced political and intellectual development throughout continental Europe, while establishing precedents for French cultural imperialism that would characterise European cultural development throughout the early modern period. The diplomatic influence that accompanied French military success enabled systematic intervention in European conflicts while creating alliance systems that supported French territorial expansion throughout subsequent centuries. The economic foundations of French continental dominance reflected the systematic development of agricultural and commercial resources that had been strengthened through successful resistance to English occupation and the administrative innovations that had enabled military recovery. French agricultural productivity, which had been systematically restored through governmental policies that encouraged rural reconstruction and population recovery, provided the economic foundation for maintaining professional military forces while supporting the bureaucratic expansion that enabled effective territorial administration. The commercial networks that connected French producers with markets throughout continental Europe generated revenues that funded military expansion, while creating economic dependencies that supported French diplomatic influence. The long-term implications of these geopolitical transformations extended throughout European international relations, as the balance between maritime and continental powers established during the Hundred Years' War influenced strategic competition throughout subsequent centuries. English maritime expansion and French continental dominance created complementary but competing approaches to international influence that would characterize European strategic competition throughout the early modern period. While the military and administrative innovations developed during the conflict provided organizational models that influenced governmental development throughout the continent, the intellectual and cultural legacy of the Hundred Years' War established precedents for national identity, governmental authority, and military organization that would influence European political development throughout the early modern period and beyond. The systematic development of vernacular languages and national cultural traditions during the conflict created intellectual foundations for the concept of national sovereignty that would dominate European political theory throughout subsequent centuries, while the administrative innovations that enabled centralized governmental authority provided organizational models for the systematic expansion of state power that characterized early modern political development. The constitutional precedents established during the conflict, particularly regarding the relationship between royal authority and representative consent in taxations and military policy, influenced governmental development throughout Europe as competing monarchies adopted and adapted the institutional innovations that had proved successful during Anglo-French warfare. The balance between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority that emerged from English constitutional development during the conflict provided models for limited monarchy that would influence political theory throughout subsequent centuries, while French precedents for royal absolutism established alternative approaches to governmental authority that would similarly influence European political development. The transformation of European society accomplished during the Hundred Years' War thus established the foundation for early modern political, military and cultural development, while creating precedents and institutional models that would influence European civilization throughout subsequent centuries. The conflict's systematic transformation of feudal society into centralized monarchical states, the development of professional military forces equipped with advanced technology, and the emergence of national consciousness based on territorial and cultural identity represented fundamental changes that established the framework within which European development would proceed throughout the early modern period. The administrative, military and cultural innovations developed during this prolonged conflict provided the institutional foundations for European expansion throughout the globe, while creating the political and social structures that would characterize European civilization until the democratic and industrial revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries transformed the foundations of political authority and social organization once again,